Hello. Hello, hello. Hey, Noodles. How's it going? Oh, hi. I was thinking today about the phrase party tricks. Or like when people are like, oh, that's a cool party trick. And I have never been at a party and somebody just does a trick. And then I was trying to think of like the things that I do that people would say is a party trick. Like I can I can like vocalize like what it sounds like when a horse is running. Oh, there we go. That's what it is, Noodles. I can vocalize like what it sounds like when a horse is running, but like I've never been like, "Hey everyone, gather round. The time has come for me to do the horse gallop." But like I don't I don't know. Is that a thing that like had to happen or is still happening? You've been at a party where a guy suddenly started playing a guitar, which I consider to be a trick. That is a trick. You are absolutely right. I guess my skills aren't like picking up a guitar. My skills are a little dumber. Like, okay, here we go. I don't know if that's coming through, but that's it. That's the horse. People who can play instruments may be witches. You're absolutely right. Yes, Noodles. I have lots of thoughts about the Internet Archive and the book depository and all that. I mean, I am of the mind that information should be free. And I understand that publishers and authors and everybody involved in the publishing company needs to be paid and should be paid. They're doing a great job, they're doing the work, everything like that. But there comes a time like being a narrator on Twitch and only reading things from public domain is is great. It's a great opportunity to do that. Figuring out what is on public domain and what isn't is a whole thing. Because things are renewed, and sometimes authors like Andre Norton, when we read her book, like it was published in 1960, but she released all of her materials to the public domain. So there's no copyright on any of it. Right? That is a very nice way of saying it. Yes, outdated is a very nice way of putting it. Yes, yes, yes. You're absolutely right. And it's just money. It's a money thing, because it's so silly and it's dumb, but here we are. So, yeah. Those be my thoughts. Um Another way to say it would be corrupt and disaster. And yeah, the list goes on and on. But outdated is the very um what is it? Like the nice way of saying it, as you said. Yeah, for sure. Also the place where we can never have generic drugs because of reasons. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of cool things about the US, but there's also a lot of not cool things about the US. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Not to be too political. Okay, reading updates. I have been reading. I don't know if that surprises you or not. Over the weekend, I went to a bookstore, a really small, cute local bookstore, and picked up. Oh gosh, I'm trying to take the book out. There we go. On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vaughn. I haven't read anything by Ocean Vaughn, but I've heard the writing style is super, super beautiful and super, super tragic, and I'm really excited to read it. and like I knew that I wanted to buy something at this little bookstore, and this was just calling my name. So I had to get it. I finished, so that's the only book that I bought, but I finished reading, what is it called? The Sign for Home yesterday. So after reading Sprints, I decided that I was just going to finish it, and I did. And I give it a solid three and a half. The story's really good. I feel like it was long, and a lot of the action happened very much at the end. And I think it could have done out of five. Sorry, Noodles. Yes, out of five. Or out of five, not out of five. I'm just trying to confuse you even more. I feel like the action happened very much towards the end of the book, and it could have been spread out more or condensed more or something. But it was 401 pages, and I don't think it needed to be that long for me to care about the characters. But it was really good. I liked it. And I am currently reading Berserk Deluxe Edition 11. I only have a couple more of these left before I'm caught up to everything that's published. I have this one. I have one other deluxe edition, and then I think two volumes that haven't been made into a deluxe edition. I think that's where we're at. But the story just keeps getting better and better and better, and I'm loving it so much. So yeah, this. What else am I reading? I don't think I'm currently reading anything else, but I do have the next deluxe edition waiting for me. I have a nonfiction book. I don't remember the author, but it's called Bad Gays, and it was rated as like a top reader choice for uh, history biography. I think that's the category. And I have Demon Slayer Volume 16 waiting for me. 16, 17, one of those, maybe both of them. And maybe that's it. Maybe. I feel like I'm missing one or two, but I think that's it. But today we are going to be continuing on with Don Quixote, Miguel by Miguel de Cervantes. We have read 18 chapters so far. We're currently on page 135. This is how far we are to give you a visual idea. Okay, so what happened last time? Where did we leave our good friends? Sancho and Don Quixote are. Oh, this was when they went to the inn. So they went to an inn, and of course, Don Quixote is like, this is a castle, that sort of thing, and ruffles some feathers. So there is a misunderstanding between Don Quixote and one of the people that work there. Code Paradigm, thank you so much for the follow. Hello. So there's like a misunderstanding between Don Quixote and somebody that works there, and the boss sees this, and like a big scuffle happens, basically. And the police are involved, and well, it's a whole thing. It was a whole mess. It sounded very cartoonish when there's like a bunch of fighting and there's like this big like cloud and you don't really know what's going on, but people are getting hit and punched and all that stuff. Uh, and the next day, Don Quixote leaves without paying his tab, and Sancho is still there, like, getting ready to leave. And they're like, okay, well, you owe us for the food, you owe us for the stay, like, all these things. And Sancho's like, well, I can't pay. Like, I don't have any money. And I am a squire of the knight, and the knight doesn't have to pay, which means the squire doesn't have to pay. So he tries to do the same thing that Don Quixote did. It didn't work. They throw him in a blanket and start like throwing him around and like tossing him. Uh, Don Quixote comes back, sort of saves him, but not really. They leave and think that they get away with something, but really the innkeeper now has their supplies. So now they don't have any food, they don't have any medical supplies, nothing. And they don't really notice it until they get hurt or until they're hungry. And they're like, oh, now we really don't have any food. And Don Quixote is like, oh man, I really would have liked some bread right now. So silly. Uh, let's see, what else? I think those are the main things that happened. Right now they're trying to find some place to sleep, I think is where we've left off. Methinks. But yeah, of course, as always, if something comes up and it's like, oh yeah, and this part happened, I'll just stop and talk about that part. So let me have a sip here and we will go ahead and get started. Mmm, water. All right, so settle in. Ooh, snuggle in, get cozy. Let's do this. Chapter 19. Regarding the discerning words that Sancho exchanged with his master, and the adventure he had with a dead body, as well as other famous events. It seems to me, Signor, that all these misfortunes we've had recently are surely a punishment for the sin your grace committed against your order of chivalry, since you didn't keep the vow you made not to eat bread from a tablecloth or to lie with the queen, and everything else that comes afterward, and that your grace swore to fulfill, including taking the helmet of Melandrino, or whatever the Moor's name was. I don't remember exactly. And there's a note here for Melandrino. It says, Sancho does not remember the name Mambrino and confuses it with Malandrine, scoundrel or rascal. You are certainly correct, Sancho, said Don Quixote. But to tell you the truth, it had slipped my mind, and you can also be sure your negligence in not reminding me of it in time is the reason you had the incident with the blanket. But I shall rectify that for you, for in the order of chivalry there are means to grant dispensations for everything. I have a good lurk. But when did I ever swear to anything? Responded Sancho. It does not matter that you have not made a vow, said Don Quixote. It is enough for me to understand that you are not completely free of complicity, and so, just in case, it would be a good idea for us to settle on a remedy. Well, if that's true, said Sancho, your grace should be sure not to forget about it the way you forgot your vow. Maybe the phantoms will feel like having fun with me again, or even with your grace, if they see you being so persistent. They were engaged in this and other conversations when night found them still on the road, not having found a place to sleep. Even worse, they were perishing of hunger, for the loss of the saddlebags meant the loss of their provisions and supplies. And as a final confirmation of their misfortune, they had an adventure that, without any kind of contrivance, really did seem to be one. And so night fell, bringing some darkness with it. But despite this, they continued on, for Sancho believed that since the road was the king's highway in 1 or 2 leagues, it was likely they would find an inn. They were riding along then, the night dark, the squire hungry, and the master with a desire to eat, when they saw coming toward them, on the same road they were traveling, a great multitude of lights that looked like nothing so much as moving stars. Sancho was frightened when he saw them, and Don Quixote felt uneasy. One tugged on his donkey's halter, and the other pulled at the reins of his skinny horse, and they came to a halt, looking carefully to see what those lights might be, and they saw them approaching, and the closer they came, the bigger they seemed. Seeing this, Sancho began to tremble like a jack-in-the-box, and the hairs on Don Quixote's head stood on end. Then, taking heart, he said, "Hey, Falcor, welcome in. This, Sancho, is undoubtedly an exceedingly great and dangerous adventure, in which it will be necessary for me to demonstrate all my valor and courage." "Woe is me," Sancho responded. "If this adventure has anything to do with phantoms, which is how it's looking to me. Who has the ribs that can stand it? Whether they are phantoms or not, said Don Quixote, I shall not permit any of them to touch even a thread of your garments, for if they had their fun with you the last time, it was because I could not get over the wall of the corral. But now we are in open country, where I shall be able to wield my sword as I choose. And if they enchant you and stop you from moving the way they did the last time, said Sancho, what difference will it make if you're in open country or not? Despite everything, replied Don Quixote, I beg you, Sancho, to have courage, for experience will allow you to understand the extent of mine. I will, may it please God, responded Sancho. And the two of them moved to the side of the road and began again to look closely to see what those traveling lights might be. And it was not long before they were able to make out a good number of shirted men, and at that fearful sight Sancho completely lost his courage, and his teeth began to chatter as if he had quartane fever, and the clatter of his teeth grew louder when they could make out clearly what this was, because they saw some 20 shirted men, all of them mounted and carrying burning torches in their hands, and behind them came a litter covered in mourning, followed by another 6 mounted men draped in mourning down to the hooves of their mules, for the calm gait made it clear that these were not horses. And there is a note here after the first mention of shirted men, and it says, the reference is to soldiers who wore shirts for a specific color over their armor during night battles, so that they would not be mistaken for the enemy. The shirted men were talking quietly among themselves in low, sorrowful voices. This strange vision, at that hour and in so deserted a place, was more than enough to instill fear in Sancho's heart, and even in his master's. And if that was true for Don Quixote, then Sancho had already lost whatever courage he had. But the opposite happened to his master, for in his vivid imagination this appeared to be another adventure from his books. It seemed to him that the litter was a bier carrying a gravely wounded or dead knight, and that it was reserved for him alone to take revenge on his behalf, and so, without another word, he couched his lance, positioned himself in the saddle, and with a gallant spirit and bearing stopped in the middle of the road along which the shirted men necessarily had to pass. When they saw that they were near, he raised his voice and said, Halt, O knights, or whomsoever you may be, and give an account of yourselves, from whence you come, whither you are going, and whom you carry on that bier. For by all indications either you have committed an offense, or one has been committed against you, and it is needful and proper that I know of it, either to punish you for your evil deeds, or to avenge the wrong that has been done to you. We're in a hurry, responded one of the shirted men, and the inn is far, and we can't stop to give the accounting you ask for. And spurring his mule, he rode forward. Don Quixote took great offense at this reply, and seizing the mule's bridle, he said, Halt, and be more courteous, and give the accounting for which I have asked. Otherwise, all of you must do battle with me. The mule was skittish, and when his bridle was seized, he became so frightened that he buckled and threw his rider to the ground. A servant who was on foot, seeing the shirted man fall, began to insult Don Quixote, who was angry by now, and without waiting to hear more, he couched his lance, attacked one of the mourners, wounded him, and knocked him to the ground. When he turned to face the rest of them, it was wonderful to see how quickly he charged and routed them, for at that moment Rocinante moved with such speed and arrogance, it seemed as if he had sprouted wings. All the shirted men were timorous and unarmed, and at the first opportunity they immediately left the fray and began to run across the fields, holding their burning torches, and they looked like nothing so much as the figures in masks who run about on nights of revels and celebrations. The men in mourning, caught up and swaddled in their soutanes and cassocks, could not move, and so, In complete safety, Don Quixote struck them all and drove them away against their will, for they all thought he was not a man but a devil from hell who had come to take the dead body they were carrying on the litter. Sancho saw it all, amazed at his master's boldness, and he said to himself, "No doubt about it, this master of mine is as courageous and brave as he says." A torch was burning on the ground next to the first man who had been thrown by his mule, and in its light Don Quixote could see him, and coming over to him he put the point of his lance to his face, telling him to yield. If not, he would kill him. To which the fallen man responded, "I have yielded, and then some. I can't move because my leg is broken. I beg your grace, if you are a Christian gentleman, not to kill me, for you would commit a great sacrilege. I am a oh my gosh, licentiate, and have taken my first vows." "Then what the devil has brought you here?" asked Don Quixote, being a man of the church. "What, señor?" replied the fallen man. My misfortune." An even greater one awaits you," said Don Quixote, "if you do not answer to my satisfaction everything I asked you earlier." "Your grace will easily have your satisfaction," responded the licentiate. "And so your grace should know that even though I said before that I am a licentiate, I am only a bachelor, and my name is Alonso Lopez. I'm a native of Alcobendas, and I have come from the city of Baeza with 11 other priests, the men who fled with the torches, who are going to the city of Segovia, escorting the dead man that lies in that litter, a gentleman who died in Baeza, where he was originally interred, and now, as I've said, we are carrying his bones to his grave in Segovia, his native city." "Well, who killed him?" asked Don Quixote. "God, by means of a pestilential fever," responded the bachelor. "In that case," said Don Quixote, "our Lord has relieved me of the task which I was going to undertake to avenge his death. If anyone else had killed him, but since he is killed by the one who killed him, there is no other recourse but to be silent and shrug one's shoulders, which is what I should do if he had killed me. And I want your reverence to know that I am a knight from La Mancha, named Don Quixote, and it is my occupation and profession to wander the world righting wrongs and rectifying injuries." Segovia is such a cool town. Have you been there? There's an aqueduct. Amazing. "I don't know how you can speak of righting wrongs," said the bachelor, "for you have certainly wronged me and broken my leg, which won't ever be right again, and in rectifying my injuries you have injured me so much that I'll go on being injured for the rest of my life. It was a great misadventure for me to run across a man who is seeking adventures." Moving my phone off of this table, it keeps going off. Okay. "Not all things," responded Don Quixote, "happen in precisely the same way. The harm, Señor Bachelor Alonso Lopez, lay in all of you coming as you did, at night, dressed in those surplices, holding burning torches, and praying, and draped in mourning, for you indeed appeared to be evil beings from the next world. As a consequence, I could not fail to fulfill my obligation and attack you, and I should have attacked even if I had known for a fact you were all demons from hell, which is what I deemed and considered you to be. Since this is what fate had in store for me," said the Bachelor of Arts, "I implore your grace, Señor Knight-errant, who has treated me with such errancy, to help me out from under this mule, for my leg is caught between the stirrup and the saddle." "I might have talked until morning," said Don Quixote. "How long would you have waited to tell me of your plight?" Then he called to Sancho Panza, who took no notice, because he was busy going through the provisions on a pack mule that belonged to those good gentlemen, and was well supplied with things to eat. Sancho made a sack out of his coat, gathered up as much as he could fit into that pouch, loaded it into his donkey, and then responded to his master's calls, and helped to remove the weight of the mule from the bachelor. After placing him on the animal's back, Sancho handed him his torch, and Don Quixote told him to follow after his companions and, on his behalf, to beg their pardon for the offense against them, which it had not been in his power to avoid committing. Sancho also said to him, "If by chance those gentlemen would like to know who the valiant man is who offended them, your grace can say he is the famous Don Quixote of La Mancha, also known as the Knight of the Sorrowful Face." At this, the bachelor rode off, and Don Quixote asked Sancho what had moved him to call him the Knight of the Sorrowful Face at that moment, and at no other. "I'll tell you," responded Sancho. "I was looking at you for a while in the light of the torch that unlucky man was carrying, and the truth is that your grace has the sorriest looking face I've seen recently, and it must be on account of your weariness after this battle, all the molars and teeth you've lost." I forgot he lost a bunch of teeth. Like all of his teeth. I forgot about that. "It is not that," responded Don Quixote, "but rather that the wise man whose task it will be to write the history of my deeds must have thought it would be a good idea if I took some appellative title, as did the knights of the past. One was called the Knight of the Blazing Sword, another the Knight of the Unicorn, yet another the Knight of the Damsels, this one the Knight of the Phoenix, that one the Knight of the Griffin, the other the Knight of Death. And by these names and insignias they were known all around the world." There's a little note here, and it says, "All of these are fictional except for the Knight of the Griffin, a count who lived during the reign of Philip II. And so I say that the wise man I have already mentioned must have put on your tongue and in your thoughts the idea of calling me the Knight of the Sorrowful Face, which is what I plan to call myself from now on, and so that this name may be even more fitting, I resolve to have depicted on my shield, when there is time, a very sorrowful face." "There's no reason to waste time and money making that face," said Sancho. "What your grace should do instead is uncover yours and show it to those who are looking at you, and right away, without any images or shields, they'll call you the Knight of the Sorrowful Face. Believe me, I'm telling you the truth, because I promise your grace, señor, and I'm only joking, that hunger and your missing teeth give you such a sorry-looking face that, as I've said, you can easily do without the sorrowful picture." Don Quixote laughed at Sancho's witticism, but even so he resolved to call himself by that name as soon as his shield or buckler could be painted as he had imagined. Then the bachelor returned and said to Don Quixote, "I forgot to say that your grace should be advised that you have been excommunicated for having laid violent hands on something sacred. Huta elude, si qui suadente diablo, etc." And there's a subscript, and it says, "This part of the phrase established by the Council of Trent for excommunicating those who committed violence against a member of the clergy." "I do not understand those Latin words," Don Quixote responded, "but I do know very well that I did not use my hands but this lance. Furthermore, I did not think I was attacking priests or things of the church, which I respect and adore as the Catholic and faithful Christian I am, but phantoms and apparitions of the next world. Even so, I remembered what happened to El Cid Ruy Diaz when he broke the chair of the king's ambassador before his holiness the Pope, for which he was excommunicated, and on that day good Rodrigo de Vivar showed himself to be a very honored and valiant knight." And there's a note here, and it says, "The incident is narrated in several ballads about El Cid." There you go. On hearing this, the bachelor left without saying a word in reply. Don Quixote wanted to see if the body on the litter was actually bones or not, but Sancho did not agree, saying, "Señor, your grace has come to the end of this dangerous adventure more safely than all the others I have seen. These people, though they've been defeated and routed, may realize that only one man defeated them and be ashamed and embarrassed by that, and they may rally and look for us and give us something we won't forget. The donkey is carrying what it should. The mountains are nearby. Hunger is pressing, and there's nothing else to do but withdraw as fast as we can, and, as they say, let the dead go to the grave, and the living to the loaf of bread. And riding ahead on his donkey, he asked his master to follow him, and since it seemed to Don Quixote that Sancho was right, he followed him without another word. After riding a short while between two hills, they found themselves in a broad, secluded valley, where they dismounted, and Sancho lightened the donkey's load, and they stretched out on a green grass, and with hunger as their sauce, they had breakfast, lunch, dinner, and supper all at once, satisfying their stomachs with more than one of the comestibles that the dead men's priests, who rarely permit themselves to go hungry, carried in their saddlebags of provisions. But they suffered another misfortune, which Sancho considered the worst of all, and it was that they had no wine to drink, or even water to put to their lips. Troubled by thirst, Sancho, seeing that the meadow where they were sitting was full of abundant green grass, said what will be recounted in the next chapter. And that's the end of chapter 19. All right, so what happened in this one? They came across some clergymen who were clearly in mourning. Oh yeah, for sure, Noodles. Take care of the real life. Who were clearly in mourning and transporting somebody who died to be buried at their place of origin. And Don Quixote just rides up, thinking that they're a threat, and attacks. And I just think it's so comical when he is addressing somebody, and how his speech changes between like addressing somebody who he doesn't know and when he's talking to Sancho. Did we talk about why his horse is called Rocinante? I don't remember. I don't think we did. Discuss, Wadsworth. Tell me, give me your insight. Oh, hello, Yoshi. Good to see you. Oh gosh, I almost lost my page. I got too excited. Sipping on water. I don't remember if we did. Although my memory lately has just been terrible. So we might have. Rocin is a workhorse, so calling your horse Rocinante is like naming your car old and busted. I don't think we talked about this. That's great. What a great name for your horse. That's amazing. That's amazing. This story is so silly. Like, of course, there's, the serious layer of things that are happening, but it's just so silly and I love it. Because ante means before, so it's used to be workhorse. Horse. That's great. That's so great. That's so clever. And like, that's such a perfect name too. For Don Quixote, who is so desperate to be a knight-errant that his armor is terrible, his squire is just going along for the lulz, basically, and that his horse is just a old broken horse. That's great. Oh my gosh. All right. Chapter 20. Regarding the most incomparable and singular adventure ever concluded with less danger by a famous knight, and which was concluded by the valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha. You've Is Sancho generally just messing with him? So I think Sancho wants adventure and wants to be happy, but he doesn't like fully he's not like fully in the same headspace that Don Quixote is. So like and I do think that he messes with him every once in a while. Like that food conversation last time when Don Quixote was like, "Oh, well, I'm a knights errant and I can just live off the land and have berries and nuts. Like, I don't need a lot of things." And then Sancho being like, "Oh, okay, cool. So I'm gonna eat this bird that we have and I will give you these nuts." Sancho is a kind soul who is sometimes half a step behind, okay, and sometimes half a step ahead. Yeah, I'm getting that as well. And they were friends. Were they friends before or just neighbors before? They knew each other before this adventure, or these various adventures, rather. And yeah, I do. Sometimes Sancho is like, I don't know what's going on. And other times he's like, dude, what are you doing? Mm, yes. Sancho, they're from the same town, and Don Quixote basically just like went up to him when he was working like in the field or something, was like, I need a squire. Be my squire. And he promised him that after all of the battles that they have, Sancho can take whatever, like loot everything, and it can be all his. And that at the end of their adventures, Don Quixote promised Sancho land of his own and like a wife and family and all of that stuff. Yeah. And Don Quixote is just going because he's being a knight and he's doing everything for Dulcinea. He does not have land to give him, no. No, he does not. But no, he does not. He absolutely does not have land. Exactly, exactly. Making a lot of promises here. All based on books. But surely he will be rewarded some. Exactly. Exactly. It will be true, right? Oh my gosh. So yeah, I think that also like plays into like him like messing with him a little bit and like pointing questions and stuff every once in a while to be like so and I don't know if you've noticed, but every time they meet people, Sancho is usually like rummaging through like their stuff and just like because like he can have whatever he wants if they win that battle. So he's just like preemptively sometimes just grabs things that aren't necessarily from battles won. So that's cool. Knights of his gallantry who perform all the deeds that he's just about to do are lavished with titles. Yes. All right. Chapter 20. It's not possible, Signor, for this grass not to be a sign that somewhere nearby there's a spring or brook that waters these plants, and so it would be a good idea for us to go a little farther until we find a place where we can quench this terrible thirst that's plaguing us and is, no doubt about it, harder to bear than hunger. This seemed good advice to Don Quixote, and after packing away the remains of their supper on that donkey, he led Rocinante by the reins, and oh my gosh, now I'm just mixing up their names. Their names are nothing alike, but I keep mixing them up. And Sancho held his donkey's halter, and they began to walk to the top of the meadow, feeling their way because the dark of night did not allow them to see anything at all. But they had not gone 200 paces when a sound of crashing reached their ears, as if water were hurtling over large, high cliffs. The sound made them very happy. and they stopped to hear where it was coming from, when they suddenly heard another exceedingly loud noise that watered down their joy at finding water, especially Sancho's, for he was naturally fearful and not very brave. They say that they heard the sound of rhythmic pounding, along with a certain clanking of irons and chains that, accompanied by the clamorous fury of the water, would have put terror in any heart other than Don Quixote. The night, as we have said, was dark, and they happened to walk under some tall trees whose leaves, moved by the gentle breeze, made a muffled, frightening sound. In short, the solitude, the place, the darkness, the noise of the water, and the murmur of the leaves all combined to cause panic and consternation, especially when they saw that the pounding did not stop, the wind did not cease, and morning did not come. Added to this was their not knowing where they were. But Don Quixote, accompanied by his intrepid heart, leaped onto Rocinante, and, holding his shield, he grasped his lance and said, "Sancho, my friend, know that I was born, by the will of heaven, in this our iron age, to revive the one of gold, or the golden age, as it is called. I am he for whom are reserved dangers, great deeds, valiant feats. I am, I repeat, he who is to revive the knights of the Round Table, the 12 peers of France, the 9 worthies, he who is to make the world forget the Plateers, Tablants, Ollivants, and Tyrants, the Phoebuses, and Belianices, and the entire horde of famous knights-errant of a bygone age, by performing in this time in which I find myself such great and extraordinary deeds and feats of arms that they will overshadow the brightest they ever achieved. Note well, my faithful and loyal squire, the darkness of this night, its strange silence, the indistinct and confused sound of these trees, the fearful clamor of the water we came seeking, which seems to be falling and crashing from the high mountains of the moon, and the unceasing noise of pounding that wounds and pains our ears. All these things taken together and separately are enough to instill fear, terror, and dread in the bosom of Mars himself, not to mention one who is unaccustomed to such occurrences and adventures. But these things I have described for you are inspiration and encouragement to my valor, which makes my heart almost burst in my bosom with the desire to embark on this adventure, no matter how difficult it may prove to be. And so, tighten the cinches on Rocinante, and God be with you, and wait for me here no more than 3 days. And if I have not come back by then, you may return to our village, and from there, as a boon and good deed for my sake, you will go to Boso and tell my peerless lady Dulcinea that her captive knight died performing deeds that would make him worthy of being called her own." When Sancho heard his master's words, he began to cry with the greatest tenderness in the world, and he said, "Señor, I don't know why your grace wants to embark on this fearful adventure. It's night. Nobody can see us here. We can turn around and get away from the danger, even if we don't drink anything for 3 days, and since there's nobody here to see us, there's nobody to call us cowards. Besides, I've heard the sermons of our village priest, and your grace knows him very well, and he says that whoever goes looking for danger perishes. So it isn't a good idea to tempt God by undertaking something so terrible that you can't get out of it except through some miracle, and heaven has done enough of them for your grace, letting you escape being tossed in the blanket, like I was, and letting you come out victorious, free and unharmed, over so many enemies who were escorting the dead man. And if all this doesn't touch or soften your hard heart, let it be moved by thinking and believing that as soon as your grace has left this place, fear will make me give up my soul to anybody who takes it. I left my home and my children and my wife to serve your grace, thinking I would be better off, not worse. But just as greed makes the sack burst, it has torn my hopes apart when they were brightest, forgetting that wretched, ill-starred insula your grace has promised me so often. I see that as payment and reward, you want to leave me now in a desolate place far from all other human beings. By the one God, Señor, you must not wrong me so, and if your grace absolutely refuses to think again about embarking on this deed, at least put it off until morning, for the lore I learned when I was a shepherd tells me it's less than 3 hours till dawn, because the month of the horn is over my head, and midnight's in line with my left arm. And there's a little note here, and it says, the horn is the constellation of Ursa Minor. Sancho refers to a method of telling the time by the stars in which a person would extend his arm in the shape of a cross and calculate the hour by determining the position of the horn in relation to his arm. That's cool. I've never heard of that. How can you, Sancho, said Don Quixote, see where that line is, or where the mouth of any horn or any head is, if the night is so dark there is not a single star visible in all the sky? That's true, said Sancho, but fear has many eyes and can see things under the ground, let alone high in the sky. Even so, it stands to reason that it won't be long until daylight. However long it may be, responded Don Quixote, let no one say of me, now or ever, that tears and pleas turned me from doing what I, as a knight, was obliged to do, and so I beg you, Sancho, to be quiet, for God, who has placed in my heart the desire to embark on this incomparable and most fearsome adventure, will surely look after my well-being and console you in your grief. What you must do is tighten Rocinante's cinches and remain here. I shall soon return, either alive or dead. Sancho, seeing his master's firm resolve, and how little he accomplished with tears, advice, and pleas, decided to take advantage of his task, and do what he could to make Don Quixote wait until day, and so, as he was tightening the horse's cinches, he very cunningly and quietly tied Rocinante's forelegs together with his donkey's halter. And when Don Quixote tried to leave, he could not, because his horse could not move except by hops and jumps. Seeing the success of his deception, Sancho Panza said, "Oh, señor, heaven, moved by my tears and prayers, has willed Rocinante not to move, and if you persist—" Realm Babe, thank you so much for the follow. Hello. Hi. Hiya. Oh, señor, heaven, moved by my tears and prayers, has willed Rocinante not to move, and if you persist and spur and urge him on, that will anger fortune, and it will be, as they say, like kicking at thorns. At this Don Quixote grew desperate, for no matter how hard he spurred his horse, he could not make him move. Then, not realizing that the animal's legs had been tied, he thought it a good idea to be calm and wait, either for the dawn or until Rocinante could move forward, believing, no doubt, that this situation was caused by something other than Sancho's labors. And so he said to him, "Well, Sancho, since Rocinante cannot move, I am content to wait until dawn smiles upon us, although I weep at how long she will take to arrive." "There's no reason to cry," responded Sancho. "I'll entertain your grace by telling you stories until daylight, unless you want to dismount and sleep a little on the green grass, in the manner of knights-errant, so that you will be rested when day comes, and ready to embark in the unrivaled adventure that awaits you." "What do you mean, dismount and sleep?" said Don Quixote. "Am I, perchance, one of the knights who take their rest in the midst of dangers? You sleep, for you were born to sleep, or do whatever you wish, and I shall do what I deem most becoming to my profession." "Señor, your grace shouldn't be angry," responded Sancho. "I didn't mean anything by it." And, going up to him, Sancho placed one hand on the front of the saddle and the other on the rear, so that he stood with his arms around his master's left thigh, not daring to move a finger's breadth away from him, so great was the fear he had of the pounding, which continued to sound rhythmically. Don Quixote told him to recount some story to amuse him, as he had promised, to which Sancho replied that he would, if his terror at what he was hearing allowed him to. But even so, I'll make an effort to tell a story, and if I manage to tell it and my fear doesn't stop me, it's the best of all stories, and your grace should pay careful attention, because here I go. Once upon a time, and may good come to all and evil to him who seeks it. And, Señor, your grace should notice that the beginnings the ancients gave to their tales didn't come out of nowhere. This was a maxim of the Roman Cato non censor, and it says, "Evil to him who seeks it," which fits here like the ring on your finger, and means that your grace should stay put, and not go looking for evil anywhere, and we should take another road. Nobody's forcing us to continue on this one with so many frightening things to scare us. And there's a note after Roman Cato non censor, and it says, Sancho is alluding to Cator the censor, or Cato Censorino, who is popularly considered to be a source of proverbs and sayings. In the process, he mispronounces his title, calling him Zonzorino, which suggests simple-minded. I have said it before, and I'm going to say it again. I love all of the confusions with the words, and I love that it's being explained here in the footnotes, because it just totally would have been lost because we're reading the translated version, how these words are so similar to each other, and it just makes me laugh. You go on with your story, Sancho, said Don Quixote, and leave the route we shall follow to me. Well, I'll tell you, Sancho continued, that somewhere in Extremadura there was a goatherd. I mean to say the man tended goats, and this goatherd I was telling you about in my story was named Lope Ruiz, and this Lope Ruiz was in love with the shepherdess named Torralba. And this shepherdess named Torralba was the daughter of a rich herder, and this rich herder... If you tell your story this way, Sancho, said Don Quixote, repeating everything you say 2 times, you will not finish in 2 days. Tell it in a continuous way, and speak like a man of understanding, or do not say anything at all. The way I'm telling it, responded Sancho, is how tales are told in my village, and I don't know any other way to tell it, and it isn't right for your grace to ask me to do things in new ways. Tell it however you wish, responded Don Quixote. Fate has willed that I cannot help listening to you, and so continue. And so it was, señor, of my soul, Sancho continued, that as I've already said, this goatherd was in love with Torralba the shepherdess, who was a stout girl, and wild, and a little mannish because she had something of a mustache. It's as if I could see her now. Then did you know her? Said Don Quixote. I didn't know her, responded Sancho, but the man who told me this story said it was so true and correct that I certainly could, when I told it to somebody else, affirm and swear that I had seen it all. And so, as the days came and went, the devil, who never sleeps and is always stirring up trouble, turned the love that the goatherd had for the shepherdess into hate and ill will, and the reason was, the gossips said, a certain amount of jealousy that she made him feel, and it went too far, into forbidden areas. And then the goatherd hated her so much that in order not to see her, he wanted to leave his home and go where he would never lay eyes on her again. Torralba, when she found herself rejected by Lope, began to love him dearly, though she had never loved him before. That is the nature of women, said Don Quixote. They reject the man who loves them and love the man who despises them. Go on, Sancho. I love when men explain exactly what it's like for women. It so happened, said Sancho, that the goatherd put his plan into effect, and, driving his goats ahead of him, he set out through the countryside of Extremadura, heading for the kingdom of Portugal. Torralba, who found this out, went after him. and followed him at a distance, walking barefoot, with a staff in her hand and some saddlebags around her neck. And in them she was carrying, people say, a piece of mirror and a broken comb, and some kind of paint for her face. But whatever it was that she was carrying, I don't want to take the trouble to find out about it. So I'll just say that people say that the goat herd and his flock came to Guadiana River, and at that time of year it was rising and almost flooding its banks, and at that part he came to there wasn't any boats or barge or anybody to ferry him and his flock to the other side. And this caused him a lot of grief, because he saw that Tiralba was coming closer and closer, and would bother him with her pleading and her tears. But he kept looking around until he saw a fisherman with a boat, one so small that only one person and one goat could fit in it. Even so, he talked to him, and they arranged for the fisherman to ferry him and his 300 goats across the river. The fisherman got into the boat and ferried across a goat. He came back and ferried another one. He came back again and again. He ferried one across. Your Grace has to keep count of the goats the fisherman ferries across, because if you miss one, the story will be over and it won't be possible to say another word. And so I'll go on and say that the landing on the other side was very muddy and slippery, and it took the fisherman a long time to go back and forth. Even so, he came back for another goat, and another, and another. Just say he ferried them all, said Don Quixote. If you keep going back and forth like that, it will take you a year to get them across. How many have gone so far? Said Sancho. How the devil should I know? Responded Don Quixote. That's just what I told your Grace to do, to keep a good count. Well, by God, the story's over and there's no way to go on. How can that be? Responded Don Quixote. It is so essential to the story to know the exact number of goats that have crossed that a mistake in the count means you cannot continue the tale. No, senor, I can't, responded Sancho, because as soon as I asked your Grace to tell me how many goats had crossed, and you said you didn't know, at that very moment I forgot everything I had left to say. And, by my faith, it's very interesting and pleasing. Do you mean to say that the story's finished? Said Don Quixote. As finished as my mother, said Sancho. What a weird thing to say. I tell you truthfully, responded Don Quixote, that you have told one of the strangest tales, stories, or histories that anyone in the world ever thought of, and this manner of telling it, and then stopping it, is something I shall never see, and have never seen in my life, although I expected nothing else from your intellect. But I am not surprised, for perhaps the sound of the pounding, which has not ceased, has clouded your understanding. That may be, responded Sancho, but I know that in my story there's nothing else to say. It ended right where you lost count of the number of goats that had crossed. Then let it end where it will, said Don Quixote, and now let us see if Rocinante can move. He spurred him again, and Rocinante hopped again, and then stood still. That is how well he was tied. At this moment it seems that, either because of the cold of the morning which was approaching, or because Sancho had eaten something laxative for supper, or because it was in the natural order of things which is the most credible, he felt the urge and desire to do what no one else could do for him, but his heart was so overwhelmed by fear that he did not dare to move a nail, paring away from his master. But not doing what he desired to do was not possible, either. And so what he did as a compromise was to free his right hand, which was clutching the back of the saddle, and with it, cunningly, and without making a sound, he loosened the slip knot that was the only thing holding up his breeches. And when he did, they came down and settled around his ankles like iron legs. After this, he lifted his shirt the best he could, and stuck out both buttocks, which were not very small. Having done this, which he thought was all he had to do to escape that terrible difficulty and anguish, he was overcome by an even greater distress, which was that it seemed to him he could not relieve himself without making some noise and sound, and he began to clench his teeth and hunch his shoulders, holding his breath as much as he could, but despite all his efforts, he was so unfortunate that he finally made a little noise quite different from the one that had caused him so much fear. Don Quixote heard it. Apple Alice, welcome in. Thank you for the follow. There we go. Just mixing all of my sentences in one. Thank you, thank you. We've all been there. Well, and I'm also wondering if it's still part of that medicine that Don Quixote made that made them extremely sick. What sound is that, Sancho? I don't know, senor, he responded. It must be something new. Adventures and misadventures never begin for no reason. He tried his luck again, and things went so smoothly that with no more noise or disturbance than the last time, he found himself rid of the burden that had caused him so much grief. But since Don Quixote had a sense of smell as acute as his hearing, and Sancho was joined so closely to him, and the vapors rose up almost in a straight line, some unavoidably reached his nostrils, and as soon as they did, he came to the assistance of his nostrils and squeezed them closed between his two fingers, and in a somewhat nasal voice he said,
"It seems to me, Sancho, that you are very frightened."
"Yes, I am," responded Sancho, "but what makes your grace see that now more than ever?" "Because you smell now more than ever, and not of amber," responded Don Quixote. "That might be," said Sancho, "but it's not my fault. It's your grace's for choosing the most ungodly times to put me through the strangest paces." "Take 3 or 4 of them back, friend," said Don Quixote without removing...
"Take 3 or 4 of them back, friend,"
said Don Quixote without removing his fingers from his nose.
"And from now on, be more mindful of your person and of what you owe to mine. Engaging in so much conversation with you has caused this lack of respect."
"I'll wager," replied Sancho, "that your grace thinks I've done something with my person I shouldn't have." Is this a long... Okay, it's not.
"The less said, the better, Sancho, my friend."
I was hoping it wasn't going to be like a full paragraph of him talking, and it's not. Master and servant passed the night in these exchanges, and others like them. But Sancho, seeing that morning would soon be upon them, very carefully unhobbled Rocinante and tied up his breeches. When Rocinante found himself free, though he was not by nature high-spirited, it seems he felt offended and began to paw the ground because, and for this I beg his pardon, he could not prance. Don Quixote, seeing that Rocinante was moving again, took this as a favorable sign, and believed it meant he should embark on the fearful adventure. By this time dawn finally had made its presence known and changed the appearance of things, and Don Quixote saw that he was under some tall trees. They were chestnuts, and cast a very dark shadow. He also heard that the pounding had not stopped, but he did not see who could be causing it, and so, with no further delay, he made Rocinante feel his spurs, and, turning to take his leave of Sancho, he ordered him to wait no more than 3 days, as he had already told him, and if at the end of that time he had not returned, Sancho could be certain it had been God's will that his master's days come to an end in that perilous adventure. Don Quixote told him again about the message and communication he was to take to his lady Dulcinea. As for payment for his services, Sancho should not be concerned because Don Quixote had made his will before leaving home, and in it the squire would find himself recompensed for everything relating to his salary, the amount prorated according to the length of time he had been in his service. But if God allowed him to emerge from this danger safe and sound and unharmed, then Sancho could be more than certain of the promised insula. Sancho began to cry again, when he heard the sorrowful words of his good master, and he resolved not to leave him until the final conclusion and end of that affair. These tears and Sancho Panza's honorable decision led the author to this history to conclude that he must have been well-born and, at the very least, an old Christian. The sentiment softened his master somewhat, but not enough for him to demonstrate any weakness. Instead, dissimulating as much as he could, the word was between two lines in a weird spot. Dissimulating as much as he could, he began to ride toward the place where it seemed to him the sound of the water and the pounding originated. Okay, and there is a note here after Old Christian. It says an old and Christian are both capitalized. It says a term used to describe those who had no Jewish or Muslim ancestors, as opposed to more recent converts, the New Christians. Being an old Christian was considered a significant attribute following the forced conversions of the 15th and 16th centuries. Sancho followed on foot, leading by the halter, as was his custom. The donkey, who was his constant companion in good fortune and bad, having traveled some distance through those somber chestnut trees, they came upon a small meadow at the foot of some high crags, over which a great rush of water fell. At the foot of the crags were some dilapidated hovels that looked more like ruins than houses, and they realized that the noise and din of the pounding, which had not ceased, was coming from these structures. Rocinante became agitated by the clamor of the water and the pounding, and Don Quixote, calming him, gradually approached the hovels, commending himself with all his heart to his lady, imploring that she favor him in this fearsome circumstance and undertaking, and he also commended himself to God, praying that he not forget him. Sancho did not leave his side, craning his neck and peering between the legs of Rocinante to see if he could see what it was that had so frightened and perplexed him. They must have gone another 100 paces when, as they turned a corner, there appeared, clear and plain, the unmistakable cause of the terrible sounds and, for them, terrifying noise that had kept them frightened and perplexed the whole night. And it was, if you have not already guessed, O reader, in sorrow and anger, 6 wooden fulling hammers that with their alternating strokes were responsible for the clamor. When Don Quixote saw this, he fell silent and sat as if paralyzed from head to toe. Sancho looked at him and saw that his head hung down toward his chest, indicating that he was mortified. Definitely my number one guess. Absolutely. Like, you didn't even need to put that note in there. We all knew. Don Quixote also looked at Sancho and saw that his cheeks were puffed out and his mouth full of laughter, clear signs that he soon would explode, and Don Quixote's melancholy was not so great that he could resist laughing at the sight of Sancho, and when Sancho saw that his master had begun, the floodgates opened with such force that he had to press his sides and his fists to keep from bursting with laughter. 4 times he calmed down, and 4 times his laughter returned as powerfully as before. By now Don Quixote was sending him to the devil, especially when he heard him say in a derisive tone, "Sancho, my friend, know that I was born by the will of heaven in this our iron age, to revive the one of gold, or the golden age. I am he for whom are reserved dangers, great deeds, valiant feats." And in this fashion he repeated all or most of the words that Don Quixote had said when they first heard the fearful pounding. Don Quixote, seeing that Sancho was mocking him, became so wrathful and angry that he raised his lance and struck him twice, blows so hard that if he had received them on his head instead of his back, his master would have been freed of the obligation of paying his salary, unless it was to his heirs. Sancho, seeing that his jokes were taken so seriously and fearing that his master would go even further, said to him very humbly, Your Grace should calm down. By God, I'm only joking. Well, you may be joking, but I am not, responded Don Quixote. There's a note here, and it says, for the next few sentences, Don Quixote uses a more formal mode of address with Sancho, a change that cannot be rendered in modern English, to indicate extreme displeasure and his desire for distance between them. That's a cool note, and I do know that Spanish does do that, and it's sort of like the idea of like mother versus mom or mommy, something like that, like a closeness. That's kind of cool. Come here, you merry man. Do you think that if these were not fulling hammers but a dangerous adventure, I would not have displayed the courage needed to undertake and conclude it? Am I obliged, perchance, being, as I am, a knight, to recognize and differentiate sounds, and know which are fulling hammers and which are not? Moreover, it well might be, as is the case, that I have never seen them in my life, though you must have, being the low-born peasant you are, and reared and born among them. If not, pretend that these 6 fulling hammers are 6 giants, and turn them on me one by one, or all together. And if I do not knock them all to the ground, you can mock me in any way you choose. No more, señor, replied Sancho. I confess that I have gone a little too far with my joking, but tell me, your grace, now that we're at peace, and may God bring you as safe and sound through all the adventures you have as he has brought you through this one. Wasn't it laughable how frightened we were? And wouldn't it make a good story? At least how frightened I was, for I already know that your grace doesn't know what fright is or understand the meaning of fear or terror. At least... Oh, I do not deny, responded Don Quixote, that what happened to us is deserving of laughter, but it does not deserve to be told, for not all persons are wise enough to put things in their proper place. At least, responded Sancho, your grace knew how to place the lance, aiming for my head and hitting me on the back, thanks be to God, and the care I took to move to the side. Well, well, it all comes out in the end, for I've heard people say, the one who hurts you is the one who loves you, and I've also heard that great gentleman, after speaking harshly to a servant, give him breeches, though I don't know what they give after beating him with a lance, unless knights-errant give insulas after a beating, or kingdoms on dry land. The dice may fall, said Don Quixote, so that everything you say turns out to be true. Forgive what happened, for you are clever and know that first impulses are not ours to control. But be advised, for one thing, from now on you are to refrain and abstain from speaking too much to me, for in all the books of chivalry I have read, which are infinite in number, I have never found any squire who talks as much with his master as you do with yours. In truth, I consider it a great fault, both on your part and on mine. On yours, because you do not have a high opinion of me. On mine, because I do not allow a higher opinion. For instance, Gandalin, the squire of Amadis of Gaul, became Count of Insula Firme. Yet one reads of him that he always spoke to his master with hat in hand, bending his head and bowing his body more turquesco. There's a note, and it says Latin for in the Turkish manner. And what shall we say of Gasabal, the squire of Don Galaor, or who was so silent that in order to declare to us the excellence of his wondrous silence, his name is mentioned only once in the course of that history, as great as it is true. From everything I have said, you must infer, Sancho, that it is necessary to distinguish between master and minion, gentleman and servant, knight and squire. Therefore, from this day forward, we must treat each other with more respect and refrain from mockery, because no matter why I lose my temper with you, it will be bad for the picture. There's a note here. This is the second half of a proverb. It doesn't matter if the pitcher hits the stone or the stone hits the pitcher. It will be bad for the pitcher. The rewards and benefits that I have promised you will come in time, and if they do not, your wages, at least, will not be lost, as I have already told you. Everything your grace says is fine, said Sancho, but I'd like to know, if the time for rewards happens not to come, and it's necessary to fall back on wages, how much the squire of a knight-errant earned in those days, and if he was paid by the month or by the day, like a mason's helper. I do not believe, Don Quixote responded, that those squires ever received wages, but only favors, and if I have mentioned you in the last will and testament that I left in my house, it was because of what might happen, for I do not yet know the standing of chivalry in our calamitous times, and I should not want my soul to suffer in the next world on account of trivial details. Because I want you to know, Sancho, that there is no profession more dangerous than that of adventuring knight. That's true, said Sancho, for just the noise of the fulling hammers could upset and disturb the heart of an adventuring knight-errant as valiant as your grace. But you can be sure that from now on my lips will not open to joke about your grace's affairs, but only to honor you as my master and natural lord. In that way, replied Don Quixote, you will live long on the face of the earth, for after parents, masters must be respected as if they were progenitors. End of chapter 20. Alright, so what happened in this one? So they're going about, they find a place to sleep, but there's a bunch of creepy noises and like pounding noises and things like that. And Sancho is terrified, but Don Quixote gives a whole speech about why he's not terrified, and this is his duty, and blah blah blah. And so to stop him, he like ties Rocinante's legs so that he can't move. And Don Quixote just sits on the horse all night, just waiting for Rocinante to move when Rocinante is ready. And Sancho is like telling a story. It's their dynamic is just so interesting to me, and it seems like they are friends and they have that bond, but if they are too friendly, then Don Quixote realizes like, oh wait, we're not actually friends. Like, I am a knight-errant and you are a squire, and this is not how we need to be acting. Like, you need to be this way. And it's also interesting how fragile Don Quixote was in that moment of being mocked, um, because he was not mocked, but told before, like, none of this is real. We don't know what you're talking about. We can't see all of that. This is just an inn. And he hasn't been, like, offended. He's just been like, yeah, it is. And he just, like, moves on with it. So that's interesting. And I think it's just because Sancho is getting closer to him, maybe? So he's holding his words in, like, higher order than other folk. All right. Chapter 21. So many sips. So many sips. I'm just so thirsty. 106 times. And not one sip more than that. Okay, let's see. Okay. Chapter 21. This is how far we are. We're on page 152. Chapter 21. which relates the high adventure and rich prize of the helmet of Membrino, as well as other things that befell our invincible knight. At this point, a light rain began to fall, and Sancho would have liked for them to take shelter in the fulling mill, but Don Quixote had acquired such an aversion to it because of the insufferable deception that under no circumstance did he wish to go inside. And so, turning to the right, they came upon another road similar to the one they had followed on the previous day. A short while later, Don Quixote caught sight of a man riding toward them and wearing on his head something that glistened as it were made of gold. And no sooner had he seen him than he turned to Sancho and said, "It seems to me, Sancho, that there is no proverb that is not true, because all of them are judgments based on experience, the mother of all knowledge. In particular, the one that says, 'One door closes, and another opens.' I say this because if last night Fortune closed the door on what we were seeking, deceiving us with fulling hammers, now she opens wide another that will lead to a better and truer adventure. If I do not succeed in going through the door, the fault will be mine, and I shall not be able to blame my ignorance of fulling hammers or the dark of night. I say this because, unless I am mistaken, coming toward us is a man who wears on his head the helmet of Membrino, concerning which, as you well know, I have made a vow." And there is a note here after Membrino, and it says, "An enchanted helmet worn by Rinaldos de Montalban." "Your Grace, be careful what you say, and more careful what you do," said Sancho, "for you wouldn't want this to be more fulling hammers that end up hammering and battering our senses." "The devil take the man," replied Don Quixote. "What does a helmet have to do with fulling hammers?" "I don't know anything about that," responded Sancho. "But by my faith, if I could talk as much as I used to, maybe I could say some things that would make your Grace see that you are mistaken in what you said." Oh, good Wadsworth, I'm so excited that you like this part. "How can I be mistaken in what I say in doubting, traitor? It is not illustrated, no," said Don Quixote. "Tell me, do you not see that knight coming toward us, mounted on a dappled grey, and wearing on his head a helmet of gold?" "What I see and can make out," responded Sancho, "is just a man riding a donkey that's grey like mine, and wearing something shiny on his head." "Well, that is the helmet of Mambrino," said Don Quixote. "Move aside, and let me face him alone. You will see that without speaking a word, so as not to waste time, I shall bring this adventure to a conclusion, and acquire the helmet I have so long desired." The illustrations might be helpful for this section depending on how the translation comes out. Okay. We'll see. Hopefully they'll be good. "I'll be sure to move aside," replied Sancho. "But may it please God," he continued, "that it turns out to be oregano and not fulling hammers." And there's a note here, and it says Sancho is citing part of the proverb, "May it please God that this is oregano and not caraway," which warns against fool's gold. Oregano was considered more valuable than caraway. "I have already told you, brother, not to mention or even think about mentioning those fulling hammers to me," said Don Quixote, "or I swear I shall say no more, but I shall hammer and full your soul." Sancho fell silent, fearful his master might carry out the vow as roundly categorical as the ball that he had hurled at him. This is the truth concerning the helmet, the horse, and the knight that Don Quixote saw. In that area there were two villages, one of them so small it did not have an apothecary or a barber, but the other, which was nearby, did. And so the barber in the larger one served the smaller, where a man happened to be sick and needed to be bled, and another needed to have his beard trimmed, and consequently the barber was traveling there, carrying a brass basin. As luck would have it, as he was traveling, it began to rain, and to keep his hat from being stained, for it must have been new, he put the basin on his head, and since it would clean, at a distance of half a league, it glistened. He was riding a gray donkey, as Sancho had said, which gave rise to Don Quixote's thinking that he saw a dappled gray, a knight, and a gold helmet. For everything he saw, he was easily accommodated to his chivalric nonsense and errant thoughts. And when he saw the poor gentleman approaching, without saying a word to him, and with Rocinante at full gallop, he attacked, with lower pike, intending to run him through. But when he drew near, without stopping the fury of his charge, he cried, "Defend yourself, base creature, or hand over to me, of your own free will, what is so rightly mine." The barber, who never imagined or feared such a thing when he saw that apparition bearing down on him, had no other choice, in order to protect himself from the lance, than to fall off his donkey, and as soon as he touched the ground, he leaped up as nimbly as a deer, and began to run across the plain, so fast the wind could not catch him. He left the basin on the ground, which satisfied Don Quixote, who said that the heathen had behaved with discretion, and imitated the beaver, which, finding itself pursued by hunters, bites and tears off the thing for which he knows, by natural instinct, he's being hunted down. And there is a note here, and it says, castor, a strong-smelling secretion of the beaver's sexual glands, was used in making perfume. The more you know. He told Sancho to pick up the helmet, and the squire, lifting the basin in his hands, said, "By God, this is a good basin. It must be worth 8 reales, if it's worth a maravedi. It's still used in candy? What?" And he gave it to his master, who then put it on his head, turning it round from one side to the other, looking for the visor. And since he did not find it, he said, "No doubt the heathen for whom this famous sallet helmet was first forged must have had an extremely large head. First of all, half of it is missing." When Sancho heard the basin called a sallet, he could not contain his laughter. But then he recalled his master's wrath, and he broke off in the middle. "Why are you laughing, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "It makes me laugh," he responded, "to think of the big head on which that heathen owner of this old helmet, which looks exactly like a barber's basin." "Do you know what I imagine, Sancho? This famous piece of the enchanted helmet, by some strange accident, must have fallen into the hands of one who could not recognize or estimate its value, and not knowing what he was doing, and seeing that it was made of purest gold, he must have melted down one half to take advantage of its high price, and from the other half he made this, which resembles a barber's bin, as you say. Be that as it may, I recognize it, and its transmutation does not matter to me, for I shall repair it in the first village that has a blacksmith, and in a manner that will leave far behind the one made and forged by the god of smithies for the god of war. In the meantime, I shall do the best I can to wear it, for something is better than nothing, especially since it will serve quite well to protect me from any stones that people may throw at me." And there's a note after God of War that says, "Vulcan made armor for Mars, but not a helmet." "It will," said Sancho. "If they're not using a slingshot like they did in the battle of the two armies, when they made the sign of the cross over your grace's molars and broke the cruet that held the blessed potion that made me vomit up my innards. Losing it does not grieve me greatly, for you know, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "that I have the recipe committed to memory." "So do I," responded Sancho, "but if I ever make it or taste it again in my life, let this be my final hour. Besides, I don't intend to put myself in the position of needing it, because I plan to use all my 5 senses to keep from being wounded or wounding anybody else. As for being tossed in a blanket again, I won't say another word, for such misfortunes are difficult to foresee, and if they come, all you can do is shrug your shoulders, hold your breath, close your eyes, and let yourself go where luck and the blanket take you. You are a bad Christian, Sancho, said Don Quixote when he heard this, because you never forget an injury once it has been done to you. But you should know that noble and generous bosoms do not pay attention to trifles. Were you left with a lame foot, a cracked rib, a broken skull? Is that why you never can forget the jest? For, if the matter is viewed correctly, it was merely a jest and a diversion. If I did not understand it in that way, I should have returned and, in avenging you, inflicted more harm than the Greeks did because of the abducted Helen, who, if she had lived in this time, or my Dulcinea lived in hers, could be certain of not enjoying the reputation for her beauty she has now. Whereupon he heaved a sigh and sent it heavenward, and Sancho said, "Let it pass as a joke, since it can't be avenged in reality, but I know what this reality and this joke mean, and I also know they won't fall away from my memory any more than they'll fade from my back. But, leaving that aside, your grace should tell me what we're going to do with this dappled gray horse that looks like a gray donkey and was left behind by that Martino, who was toppled by your grace, because seeing how he took to his heels and ran like Villadiego, he has no intention of ever coming back for it. By my beard, this dappled gray is a good one." And we have 2 notes. Martino. Sancho means Mambrino. And then for Villadiego, an idiom used earlier that means to flee in unexpected danger. "It has never been my practice," said Don Quixote, "to plunder those I conquer, nor is it a knightly custom to deprive them of their horses and leave them on foot, unless the victor has lost his mount in the battle. In such cases, it is licit to take that of the conquered knight as the spoils of legitimate combat. Therefore, Sancho, leave his horse or donkey, or whatever you say it is, for when its owner sees that we have departed, we will return for it. Or he will return for it." "God knows I'd like to take it," replied Sancho, "or at least exchange it for this one of mine, because I don't think it's as good. Really, the laws of chivalry are strict if they can't be stretched to let you trade one donkey for another. I'd like to know if I could at least swap the trappings." "I am not certain about that," responded Don Quixote. "In case of doubt, until I am better informed, I should say that you may exchange them if you are in dire need of them." "So dire," responded Sancho, "that if they were for my own person, I couldn't need them more." Then, on the basis of that permission, he executed a mutatio comparium and decked out his donkey, showing him off to a great advantage. And there is a note, and it says, "A ritual in which cardinals change their hoods on Easter Sunday." I've never heard that before. Having done this, they ate the remains of the food that had been taken from the pack mule and drank from the stream where the fulling hammers were, not turning their faces to look at them, so great was their loathing because of how much they had frightened him. Having pacified their hunger and tempered their melancholy, they remounted, and with no fixed destination, since it was very much in the tradition of knights-errant not to follow a specific route, they began to hide wherever Rocinante's will took them. Behind his will came his masters, and even the donkeys, who always followed wherever the horse led, in virtuous love and companionship. And so they returned to the king's highway, and followed it with no set plan or purpose in mind. As they were riding along, Sancho said to his master, "Señor, does your grace wish to give me leave to talk a little? After you gave me that harsh order of silence, more than a few things have been spoiling in my stomach, and one that I have now on the tip of my tongue I wouldn't want to go to waste." "Say it," Don Quixote said, "and be brief, for no speech is pleasing if it is long." "What I have to say, señor," responded Sancho, "is that for the past few days I have been thinking how little gain or profit there is in looking for the adventures that your grace looks for in these deserted places and crossroads. Because even when you conquer and conclude the most dangerous, there's nobody to see them or know about them, and so they remain in perpetual silence, which isn't your grace's intention or what they deserve. And so it seems to me it would be better, unless your grace thinks otherwise, if we went to serve some emperor or other great prince who's involved in some war, and in his service your grace could demonstrate the valor of your person with great strength and even greater understanding. And when the Lord we serve sees this, he'll have to reward us, each according to his merits. And there's sure to be somebody there who will put into writing your grace's great deeds, so they can be remembered forever. About mine, I don't say anything, for they won't go beyond squirely limits. Though I can say, if it's customary in chivalry to write about the deeds of squires, I don't think mine will be forgotten." "You speak sensibly, Sancho," responded Don Quixote. "But before one reaches that point, it is necessary to wander the world as a kind of test, seeking adventures, so that by concluding some of them, the knight acquires a reputation and fame, and when he goes to the court of some great monarch, he is known by his deeds, and as soon as the boys see him ride through the gate of the city, they all follow and surround him, shouting and saying, 'Here is the Knight of the Sun, or of the Serpent, or of some other device under which he accomplished great fears. Here is,' they will say, 'the one who conquered in singular combat the gigantic Bacabruno the mighty, the one who freed the great Mameluke of Persia from the long enchantment he suffered for almost 900 years.' In this manner news of his deeds passes from person to person, and then, to the cheers of the boys and the rest of the populace, the knight or the king of the land will appear at the window of his royal palace, and as soon as he sees the knight, knowing him by his armor or the device of his shield, he perforce will say, 'Hark! Look lively! Go forth, my knights, all who are in my court, to greet the flower of chivalry who now comes riding.' At this command all will go forth, and the king will come halfway down the stairs and embrace the knight warmly, and bid him welcome, kissing him on the face, and then he will lead him by the hand to the chamber of my lady, the queen, where the knight will find her with the princess, their daughter, who is, beyond any doubt, one of the most beauteous and perfect damsels that one could find anywhere in the known regions of the earth. After this, she will very chastely turn her eyes to the knight, and he will turn his eyes to hers, and each will seem to the other more divine than human, and without knowing how or why, they will be captured and caught in the intricate nets of love, with great affection in their hearts, because they do not know how they will speak and reveal to one another their yearnings and desires. Then he will no doubt be taken to a sumptuously appointed room in the palace, where, having removed his armor, they will bring him a rich scarlet cloak and drape it around him. And if he looked comely in armor, he looks just as comely and even more so in his kilted doublet. When night falls, he will have supper with the king, queen, and princes, and he will never take his eyes off the maiden, his looks hidden from the rest. And she will do the same with the same sagacity, because, as I have said, she's a very discreet damsel. The tables will be cleared, and then suddenly, through the door of the chamber, an ugly dwarf will enter, followed by a beauteous duenna between two giants, who tells of a certain adventure devised by an extremely ancient wise man, and whosoever brings it to a conclusion will be deemed the greatest knight in the world. Then the king will command all those present to attempt it, and none will finish it except the knight who is his guest, which will add greatly to his fame, and make the princess extremely happy, and she will think of herself as exceedingly well rewarded and compensated for having placed her affections so high. And the fortunate part is that this king or prince or whatever he is waging a fierce war with another as powerful as he, and the knight who is his guest asks him, after spending a few days in the court, for permission to serve him in that war. The king will give it willingly, and the knight will courteously kiss his hand in gratitude for the boon he has granted him. I haven't thought about it much, but he's still talking. He's still going. And that night he will take his leave of his lady, the princess, through the grillwork at the window of the bedchamber where she sleeps, which overlooks the garden, and through the grillwork he has already spoken to her many times, their go-between and confidant, being a lady-in-waiting greatly trusted by the princess. He will sigh, she will swoon, the lady-in-waiting will bring water, sorely troubled because morning is coming, and, for the sake of her lady's honor, she does not wish them to be discovered. Finally, the princess will regain consciousness and pass her white hands through the grillwork to the knight, who will kiss them over and over again and bathe them in his tears. The two of them will agree on the manner in which they will keep each other informed of their fortunes and misfortunes, and the princess will beg him to tarry as little as possible. He will promise, making many vows. He will kiss her hands one more time and say goodbye with so much emotion that his life will almost come to an end. Then he goes to his room, throws himself on the bed, cannot sleep because of the pain of their parting, arises very early in the morning, and goes to take his leave of the king, the queen, and the princess. They tell him, when he has bade farewell to the first two, that Her Highness the Princess is indisposed and cannot receive visitors. The knight thinks it is because of her sorrow at his leaving. His heart is wounded, and it is all he can do not to show clear signs of his suffering. The lady-in-waiting, the confidant, is present, and she will take note of everything and recount it all to her lady, who receives her in tears and tells her that one of her greatest griefs is not knowing who her knight is, or if he is of royal lineage. The lady-in-waiting assures her that the degree of courtesy, gallantry, and valor displayed by her knight can exist only in a royal and illustrious person. The suffering princess consoles herself with this. She attempts to find consolation so as not to appear in a bad light before her parents, and after 2 days she appears in public. The knight has already gone. He does battle in a war, conquers the king's enemy, takes many cities, emerges victorious from many combats, returns to court, sees his lady in the customary place, and they agree that he will ask her father for her hand in marriage in return for his services. The king does not wish to grant his request because he does not know who the knight is, but despite this, either because he abducts her or by some other means, the princess becomes his wife, and her father comes to consider this his great good fortune because he learns that this knight is the son of a valiant king, ruler of some kingdom I am not certain of because I do not believe it is on the map. The father dies, the princess inherits the kingdom, the knight, in a word, becomes king, and this is where his granting favor to his squire and to all those who helped him rise to so high an estate comes in. He marries his squire to one of the princess's ladies-in-waiting, the other, no doubt, who acted as mediator in his love affair, and who is the daughter of a very prominent duke. And there's a note here, and it says, "It should be noted that Don Quixote's tale is a perfect plot summary of a novel of chivalry." I love how he, right before going into a super long speech, is like, okay, Sancho, just don't make it a super long speech, because those are boring and nobody cares. And then, like, 5 pages later, he ends. "That's what I want, honestly," said Sancho. "And that's what I'm counting on. And everything will happen exactly to the letter because now your grace calls yourself the Knight of the Sorrowful Face." "Do not doubt it, Sancho," replied Don Quixote, "for in the same manner and by the same means I have recounted knights-errant rise and have risen to be kings and emperors. All we need do now is to see which king the Christians or heathens is waging a war and has a beautiful daughter. But there will be time to think about this, for, as I have told you, first one must win fame elsewhere before arriving at court. There is also something else. In the event we find a king at war who has a beautiful daughter, and I have won incredible fame throughout the universe, I do not know how it can be discovered that I am of royal lineage, or, at least, a second cousin to the emperor. The king will not wish to give me his daughter's hand in marriage unless he is very certain of this first, no matter how meritorious my famous deeds. As a consequence, for this reason, I fear I shall lose what my arm so justly deserves. It is certainly true that I am a gentleman of known lineage, with proprietary rights to an ancestral home and entitlement to a payment of 500 sueldos. And there's a note, and it says, under certain circumstances, it was a privilege of the gentry to collect 500 sueldos as recompense for damages of injuries. Entitled to a payment of 500 sueldos, and it well might be that the wise man who writes my history can elucidate my parentage and ancestry in such a way that I find myself to be a descendant 5 or 6 times removed of a king. Because I want you to know, Sancho, that there are 2 kinds of lineage in the world. Some who trace and derive their ancestry from princes and monarchs, which time has gradually undone, and in the end they finish in a point, like a pyramid turned upside down. Others have their origin in low-born people, and they rise by degrees until they become great lords, which means that the difference between them is that some were and no longer are, and others are what they once were not. I might be one of these, and it might turn out that I had a great and famous beginning which ought to satisfy the king, my future father-in-law. If it does not, the princess will love me so much despite her father that he, knowing full well that I am the son of a water carrier, will accept me as her lord and husband. If he does not, this is where abducting her and taking her wherever I choose comes in, for either time or death will put an end to her parents' anger. And that's something else comes into. That's where something else comes into, said Sancho. Because some wicked people say, don't ask a favor what you can take by force. Though what fits even better is, escaping punishment is worth more than the pleading of good men. I say this because if my lord the king, your grace's father-in-law, does not agree to giving you my lady the princess, there's nothing else to do, like your grace says, but abduct her and hide her away. But the trouble with that is that until you make peace and calmly enjoy the kingdom, the poor squire may be starving for favors, unless the go-between, lady-in-waiting, who will be his wife, escapes with the princess, and he suffers misfortunes with her until heaven wills otherwise, because it may be, I think, that his master will give her to him as his legitimate wife. No one can deny him that, said Don Quixote. Well, since that's the case, responded Sancho, the best thing is to commend ourselves to God and let fate take us wherever it chooses. May God grant, replied Don Quixote, what I desire and what you, Sancho, need, and let him be base who thinks himself base. God's will be done, said Sancho, for I am an old Christian, and that alone is enough for me to be a count. More than enough, said Don Quixote, and even if you were not, it would not change anything, because when I am king I can certainly grant you nobility, without your buying it or serving me in any way, because when you are made a count, you will find that you are a gentleman, too, and no matter what people say, they will have to call you lord, even if they do not wish to. Why you so based, bruh? And by my faith, I know how to carry off that title, said Sancho. Oh, so it is spelled wrong, and I was like, oh, it's just a typo. But the next sentence, he's corrected. So let me go back and say it the wrong way. And by my faith, I know how to carry off that tittle, said Sancho. You mean title, not tittle, said his master. Whatever it is, responded Sancho Panza, I say that I know very well how to manage it, because, by my faith, once I was the beadle of a brotherhood, and the beadle's outfit looked so good on me that everybody said I looked like I could be the steward of the brotherhood. Well, what will happen when I put a duke's cape on my back, or dress in gold and pearls like a foreign count? I think they'll be coming to see me for 100 leagues around. You go get them tittles, Sancho. You will look fine, said Don Quixote, but it will be necessary for you to shave your beard often. Yours is so heavy, tangled, and unkempt that unless you shave with a razor at least every other day, people will see what you are from as far away as you can shoot a flintlock. That's easy, said Sancho. All I have to do is hire a barber and keep him in my house. And if I need to, I can have him follow along behind me, like a grandee's groom. But how do you know, asked Don Quixote, that grandees have their grooms follow them? I'll tell you, responded Sancho. Years ago, I spent a month not far from court, and there I saw a very small gentleman walking, and people said he was a grandee, and a man rode behind him no matter how many turns he made, and he looked like he was his tail. I asked why the man didn't catch up, but always came behind him. They told me he was the groom, and it was the custom of grandees to have their grooms follow behind. And since then, I've known it so well that I've never forgotten it. I say that you are correct, said Don Quixote, and in the same way you can have your barber follow you. For not all customs came into use or were invented at the same time, and you may be the first count to have his barber follow him behind him, for you need greater confidence in the man who shaves you than in the one who saddles your horse. Just leave the barber to me, said Sancho, and your grace can take care of becoming a king and making me a count. That is what I shall do, responded Don Quixote, and looking up, he saw what will be recounted in the next chapter. End of chapter 21. It's interesting that at the end of the chapter, the past couple ones anyway, it's like, and Sancho responded like this in the next chapter. And then this one, he looked up, and what he saw, you gotta read the next chapter to find out. Sancho. Okay, dude. But I'm gonna be a count, right? And okay, Sancho is quickly becoming an amazing character in my mind. Just like the fact that he was like, I know that I will be amazing because I wore clothes and people thought that I was part of the Brotherhood. So I just know that if I put on these other clothes, that people are gonna think that I'm this. Yes, the helmet is in all of the iconic. Yes. It's so good. It's so great. Easy peasy. Just put on clothes. That is what you are. I mean, you're supposed to what? Dress the way, or just dress for the job you want. That's all Sancho's trying to do. So good. All right. Chapter 22. Let's find out what he saw. Chapter 22. Regarding the liberty that Don Quixote gave to many unfortunate men who, against their wills, were being taken where they did not wish to go. It is recounted by Cid Hamete Benengeli, the Arabic and Manchegan author, in this most serious, high-sounding, detailed, sweet, and inventive history, that following the conversation between the famous Don Quixote of La Mancha and Sancho Panza, his squire, which is referred to at the end of chapter 21, Don Quixote looked up and saw coming toward him on the same road he was traveling approximately 12 men on foot, strung together by their necks like beads on a great iron chain, and all of them wearing monocles. Accompanying them were 2 men on horseback and 2 on foot. The ones on horseback had flintlocks, and those on foot carried javelins and swords. As soon as Sancho Panza saw them, he said, "This is a chain of galley slaves, people forced by the king to go to the galleys." "What do you mean, forced?" asked Don Quixote. "Is it possible that the king forces anyone?" "I'm not saying that," responded Sancho, "but these are people who, because of their crimes, have been condemned to serve the king in the galleys by force." "Oh, Falcor, it was good to see you. We'll catch you next time." Are you saying that Don Quixote was really into The Secret? Yes. "In short," replied Don Quixote, "for whatever reason, these people are being taken by force, and not of their own free will." "That's right," said Sancho. "Well, in that case," said his master, "here it is fitting to put into practice my profession, to right wrongs and come to the aid and assistance of the wretched." "Your grace shouldn't forget," said Sancho, "that justice, which is the king himself, does not force or do wrong to such people, but sentences them as punishment for their crimes." By now the chain of galley slaves had reached them, and Don Quixote, with very courteous speech, asked those who were guarding them to be so kind as to inform him and tell him the reason, or reasons, those people were being taken away in that fashion. One of the mounted guards responded that they were galley slaves, His Majesty's prisoners, who were condemned to the galleys, and there was nothing more to say, and nothing else he had to know. "Even so," replied Don Quixote, "I should like to know the particular reason for each one's misfortune." To these words he added others so civil and discreet, to persuade them to tell him what he wished to hear, that the other mounted guard said, "Although we have the record and certificate of sentence of each of these wretched men, this is not the proper time to stop and take them out and read them. Your grace may approach and question the prisoners, and they will tell you themselves if they wish to, and they will, because these are people who take pleasure in doing and saying false and wicked things." With this authorization, which Don Quixote would have taken even if it had not been granted to him, he approached the chain and asked the first man what sins he had committed to be taken away in so unpleasant a manner. He responded that it was on account of his being a lover. "Is that all?" replied Don Quixote. "If they throw men in the galleys for being lovers, I should have been rowing in one long ago." "It isn't the kind of love your grace is thinking about," said the galley slave. "Mine was a great love for a laundry basket filled with linen, and I loved it so much and embraced it so tightly that if the law hadn't taken it from me by force, to this day I wouldn't have let go of it willingly. I was caught red-handed. There was no need for torture. The trial concluded. They kissed my back 100 times, gave me 3 of the garropas, and that was the end of that." And there is a note here, and it says, "The speech of the galley slaves is peppered with underworld slang. Here, for example, the convict says that his sentence was 100 lashes plus a term of 3 years in the galleys." "What are garropas?" said Don Quixote. "Garropas are galleys," responded the galley slave. He was a young man, about 24 years old, who said he was a native of Piedrahita. Don Quixote asked the same question of the second man, who was so downcast and melancholy he did not say a word, but the first prisoner responded for him and said, "This man, señor, is being taken away for being a canary. I mean, a musician and singer." "What?" Don Quixote repeated. "Men also go to the galleys for being musicians and singers?" "Yes, señor," responded the galley slave, "because there's nothing worse than singing when you're in difficulty. But I have heard it said, said Don Quixote, that troubles take wing for the man who can sing. Here just the opposite is true, said the galley slave. Warble once, and you weep the rest of your days. I do not understand, said Don Quixote. But one of the guards told him, Señor, among these non-sancta people, singing when you are in difficulty means confessing under torture. They tortured this sinner, and he confessed his crime, which was rustling or stealing livestock, and because he confessed he was sentenced to 6 years in the galleys, plus 200 lashes, which he already bears on his back. He's already very downhearted and sad because the rest of the thieves, the ones he left behind and the ones who are traveling with him, abuse and humiliate and insult him and think very little of him because he confessed and didn't have the courage to say his no's. Because they say no has even fewer letters than yes, and a criminal is very lucky when his life or death depends on his own words and not on those of witnesses or on evidence, and in my opinion, they're not too far off the mark. This is my understanding as well, repeated Don Quixote. He passed on to the third passenger and asked the question he had asked the others, and the man responded immediately, with great assurance, and said, I'm going to my ladies and guarapas for 5 years because I didn't have 10 gold ducados. I should gladly give 20, said Don Quixote, to free you from this sorrowful burden. It seems to me, responded the galley slave, like a man who has money in the middle of an ocean and is dying of hunger and doesn't have a place where he can buy what he needs. I say this because I'd had those 20 ducados your grace is offering me now at the right time. I'd have greased the quill of the clerk and sharpened the wits of my attorney, and today I'd be in the middle of the Plaza de Zocodover in Toledo, and not on this road, chained up like a greyhound. But God is great. All you need is patience. Don Quixote passed on to the fourth prisoner, a man of venerable countenance, with a white beard that hung down to his chest. Hearing himself asked the reason for his being there, he began to weep, and did not say a word in reply. But the fifth prisoner served as his interpreter and said, This honest man is going to the galleys for 4 years, having been paraded through the usual streets in robes of state and on horseback. There's a note here, and it says, the allusion is to the public flogging and humiliation of convicted criminals. That, it seems to me, said Sancho Panza, means he was shamed in public. That's true, replied the galley slave, and the crime he was punished for was trading in ears, and even in entire bodies. In other words, I mean that this gentleman is going to the galleys for being a go-between, and for having a hint and a touch of the sorcerer about him. And there is a note. There is a certain intentional confusion or ambiguity regarding go-between in the ensuing dialogue, which it alternately implies matchmaker and procurer. If you had not added that hint and touch, said Don Quixote, for simply being an honest go-between, he does not deserve to be sent to the galleys to row, but to lead and command. Because the position of go-between is not for just anyone, it is an office for the discreet, one that is very necessary in a well-ordered nation, and should not be practiced except by the well-born. There should be supervisors and examiners of go-betweens, as there are for other professions, with a fixed number of known appointees, similar to brokers on the exchange, and in this way many evils would be avoided, which are caused because this practice and profession is filled with idiotic and dim-witted people, such as foolish women, pages, and rascals with few years and little experience. When the occasion demands that they find a solution to an important problem, they allow the crumbs to freeze between their hands and their mouth, and do not know their right hand from their left. I should like to continue and give reason why it is appropriate to choose carefully those who fulfill so necessary a function in the nation, but this is not the proper place. One day I shall speak about it to someone who can remedy the situation. For now, I shall say only that the sorrow caused in me at seeing this old white head and venerable face in so much distress for being a go-between is mitigated by his being a sorcerer, although I know very well there is no sorcery in the world that can move and compel our desires, as some simple-minded folk believe. Our will is free, and there is no herb or spell that can force it. What certain foolish women and lying scoundrels do is prepare concoctions and poisons with which they drive men mad, claiming they have the power to make one person love another when, as I say, it is impossible to compel desires. That's true, said the old man, and in fact, Signor, in the matter of sorcery I was innocent. In the matter of being a go-between I could not deny it. But I never thought I was doing wrong. My entire intention was for everybody to be happy and to live in peace and harmony without discord or distress. But this virtuous desire did not prevent me from being sent to a place from which I do not expect to return, given the burden of my years and a urinary problem that does not give me a moment's peace. And here he began to weep again, as he had earlier, and Sancho felt so much compassion for him that he took a 4-real coin from inside his shirt and gave it to him as alms. Don Quixote moved on and asked another prisoner his crime, and he responded with not less but much more spirit and wit than the previous man. I am here because I made too merry with 2 girls who were cousins of mine, and with 2 other sisters who weren't mine. In short, I made so merry with all of them, and the merriment complicated my family relations so much that not even the devil can straighten it out. The case was proved. Nobody showed me favor. I had no money. I almost had my gullet in a noose. They sentenced me to 6 years in the galley, and I agreed. It's punishment for my crime. I'm young. Just let me stay alive, because where there's life, there's hope. If your grace, Signor, has something to help these poor men, God will reward you in heaven, and here on earth will be sure to ask God in our devotion that the life and well-being of your grace be as long-lasting and as fine as your meritorious person deserves. He was dressed as a student, and one of the guards said he was a great talker and clever in Latin. Behind all of them came a man of about 30, who was very good-looking, except that one eye tended to veer slightly toward the other. He was shackled differently from the rest, because around his foot was a chain so large it encircled his entire body, and there were 2 fetters around his neck, one attached to the chain, and the other, the kind called a keeper, or a brace, from which there hung 2 irons that reached to his waist, and on these were 2 manacles holding his hands and locked with a heavy padlock, so that he could not raise his hands to his mouth or lower his head to his hands. And there is a note here. After keeper or a brace, it says a kind of metal collar placed under the chin which prevented a prisoner from lowering his head. Don Quixote asked why that man wore so many more shackles than the others. The guard responded that it was because he alone had committed more crimes than all the rest combined, and so daring, and such a great villain, that even though he was bound in this way, they still did not feel secure about him, and were afraid he would escape. What crimes can they be? Asked Don Quixote, if they have deserved no greater punishment than his being sent to the galleys. He's going for 10 years, replied the guard, which is like a civil death. All you need to know is that this is the famous Ginés de Pasamonte, also known as Ginesillo de Parapilla. Señor Commissary, the galley slave said, just take it easy, and let's not go around dropping all kinds of names and surnames. My name is Ginés, not Ginesillo, and my family is from Pasamonte, not Parapilla, as you've said. And if each man looks to his own affairs, he'll have plenty to tend to. Keep a civil tongue, replied the commissary, you great thief, unless you want me to shut you up in a way you won't like. It certainly seems, responded the galley slave, that man proposes and God disposes. But one day somebody will know whether or not my name is Ginacio de Parapia. Well, don't they call you that, you liar? Said the guard. They do, responded Gines. But I'll make sure they don't, or I'll tear out their hair and they know where. Senor, if you have anything to give us, give it and go with God. Your wanting to know so much about other people's lives is becoming irritating. But if you want to know about mine, know that I'm Gines de Pasamonte, whose life has been written by these very fingers. And there is a note. It says, Cervantes is alluding to the picaresque novel in Gines's discussion of his book, just as he suggests the pastoral in the story of Marcella. These genres, along with novels of chivalry, were the most popular forms of prose fiction in Spain during the 16th century. He's telling the truth, said the commissary. He wrote his own history himself, as fine as you please, and he pawned the book for 200 reales and left it in prison. And I intend to redeem it, said Gines, even for 200 ducados. Is it that good? Said Don Quixote. It's so good, responded Gines, that it's too bad for Lazarillo de Tormes and all the other books of that genre that have been or will be written. What I can tell your grace is that it deals with truths, and they are truths so appealing and entertaining that no lies can equal them. And what is the title of your book? Asked Don Quixote. The Life of Gines de Pasamonte, Gines replied. And is it finished? Asked Don Quixote. He read Tallis. How can it be finished? He responded. If my life isn't finished yet, what I've written goes from my birth to the moment when they sentenced me to the galleys this last time. Then you have been here before? Said Don Quixote. To serve God and the king, I have already spent 4 years on the galleys, and I know the taste of the hardtack and the overseer's whip, responded Gines. And I'm not too sorry to go there, because I'll have time to finish my book, for I still have lots of things to say, and on the galleys of Spain there's more leisure than I'll need, though I don't need much for what I have to write because I know it by heart. You seem clever, said Don Quixote. And unfortunate, responded Gines, because misfortunes always pursue the talented. They pursue villains, said the commissary. I've already told you, Senor Commissary, responded Pasamonte, to take it easy. Those gentlemen didn't give you that staff or office for you to abuse us poor wretches, but to lead and guide us to wherever His Majesty commands. If not, by the life of... Enough! One day those dark stains at the inn may come to light, so let's all hold our tongues and live well and speak better and keep walking. The joke's gone on too long. The commissary raised his staff to strike Pasamonte in response to his threats, but Don Quixote placed himself between them and asked that he not abuse the prisoner, for it was not surprising that a man whose hands were so tightly bound would have a rather loose tongue. And turning to all those on the chain, he said, From everything you have told me, dear brothers, I deduce that although you are being punished for your faults, the penalties you are about to suffer are not to your liking, and you go to them unwillingly and involuntarily. It might be that the lack of courage is this one showed under torture, that one's need of money, another's lack of favor, and finally, the twisted judgment of the judge, have been the reason for your ruination, and for not having justice on your side, all of which is pictured in my mind, and is telling, persuading, and even compelling me to show to all of you the reason that heaven put me in the world and made me profess the order of chivalry, which I do profess, and take the vow I took to favor those in need and those oppressed by the powerful. But because I know that one of the rules of prudence is that what can be done by good means should not be done by bad, I want to ask these gentlemen, the guards and the commissary, to be so good as to unchain you and let you go in peace. There will be no lack of other men to serve the king under better circumstances, for to me it seems harsh to make slaves of those whom God and nature made free. Furthermore, these poor wretches have done nothing against you, gentlemen. Each man must bear his own sin. There is a God in heaven who does not fail to punish the wicked or reward the good, and it is not right for honorable men to persecute other men who have not harmed them. I ask this quietly and calmly, because if you comply, I shall have reason to thank you, and if you do not comply willingly, this lance and this sword and the valor of this my arm will force you to comply against your will. A fine piece of nonsense, responded the commissary. He's finally come out of it. He wants us to let the king's prisoners go, as if he had the authority to free them, or he had the authority to order us to do so. Your Grace, Signor, be on your way and straighten that basin you're wearing on your head, and don't go around looking like a three-legged cat. And there is a note, and it says a traditional expression that means don't go looking for trouble. You are the cat, the rat, and the scoundrel, responded Don Quixote. Speaking and acting were all one, and he charged so quickly that he did not give the commissary time to defend himself, and knocked him to the ground, wounding him with a thrust of his lance, and it was fortunate for Don Quixote that he did, for this was the man holding the flintlock. The other guards were stunned, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events, but they came to their senses, and those on horseback put their hands on their swords, and those on foot grasped their javelins, and they charged Don Quixote, who very calmly waited for them. Matters undoubtedly would have gone badly for him if the galley slaves, seeing the opportunity presented to them to obtain their freedom, had not attempted to achieve it by breaking the chain to which they were fettered. So great was the confusion that the guards, turning now to the galley slaves who were breaking free, and now to Don Quixote, who was attacking them, did nothing of any use. Sancho, for his part, helped to free Gines de Pasamonte, who was the first to leap into the battle free and unencumbered, and, rushing at the fallen commissary, he took his sword and flintlock, and by pointing it at one, and aiming it at another, without ever firing, he cleared the field of guards, because they all fled from Pasamonte's flintlock, and from the shower of stones that the galley slaves, who were free by now, were hurling at them. This made Sancho very sad, because it seemed to him that those who were fleeing would inform the Holy Brotherhood, who would then come looking for the lawbreakers, sounding the alarm, and he told this to his master, and begged that they leave immediately and hide in the mountains, which were not far away. That is all very well and good, said Don Quixote, but I know what must be done now. And calling to all the galley slaves who were in a state of frenzy and had stripped the commissary down to his skin, they gathered round to see what he wanted of them. And he said, "It is customary for well-born people to give thanks for the benefits they receive, and one of the sins that most offends God is ingratitude. I say this, señores, because you have already seen and made manifest proof of what you have received from me, and in payment it is my wish and desire that, bearing the chain which I removed from your necks, you immediately set out for the city of Toboso, and there appear before the lady Dulcinea of Toboso, and say that her knight, he of the sorrowful face, commends himself to her, and you will tell her, point by point, every detail of this famous adventure, up to the moment when you achieved your desired freedom. Having done this, you may go wherever you wish, and may good fortune go with you." Gines de Pasamonte responded for all of them, and he said, "What your Grace, our Lord and Liberator, orders us to do is absolutely impossible for us to carry out, because we cannot travel the roads together, but must go our separate ways, each man on his own, trying to burrow into the bowels of the earth so as not to be found by the Holy Brotherhood, who, beyond any doubt, will come looking for us. What your Grace can do, and it is right and proper that you do so, is to change the service and tribute to the Lady Dulcinea of Toboso into a certain number of Ave Marias and Credos, which we will say on your Grace's behalf. And this is something that can be done night or day, fleeing or at rest, at peace or at war. But to think that we all go back to our miseries in Egypt, I mean to say, that we will take up our chain and set out for Toboso, is to think that night has fallen down when it is not yet 10 in the morning. Asking that of us is like asking peers of an elm tree. Well then, I do swear, said Don Quixote, his wrath rising, Don Horson, Don Guinecio de Paropio, or whatever your name is, that you will go alone, your tail between your legs, and the entire chain on your back. Pasamonte was not a man of great forbearance, already aware that Don Quixote was not very sane, for he had done something so foolish as wanting to give them their freedom, and seeing himself spoken to in this way, he winked at his companions, and, moving a short distance away, they began to throw so many stones at Don Quixote that he could not even manage to protect himself with his shield, and poor Rocinante paid no more attention to his master's spurs than if he had been made of bronze. Sancho hid behind his donkey, protecting himself in his way from the hailstorm of rocks pouring down on them. Don Quixote could not shield himself as well as Sancho, for so many stones found their mark on his body, and with so much force that they knocked him to the ground. As soon as he had fallen, the student attacked him, and took the basin from his head, and struck him 3 or 4 blows with it on his shoulders, and smashed it in equal number of times on the ground, until he had shattered it. They took a doublet he wore over his armor, and would have taken his horse if the greaves of his leg armor had not prevented them from doing so. From Sancho they took his coat, leaving him shirtless. Then, after dividing among themselves the other spoils of battle, each went his separate way, more concerned with the escaping the brotherhood, which they feared, than with picking up the chain and carrying it to the Lady Dulcinea of Toboso. The donkey and Rocinante, Sancho and Don Quixote, were left alone. The donkey, pensive, with bowed head, twitching his ears from time to time, thinking that the tempest of stones had not yet ended, and was still falling around his ears. Rocinante, lying beside his master, for he too had fallen to the ground in the shower of stones. Sancho, in his shirt sleeves, and afraid of the Holy Brotherhood. Don Quixote, grief-stricken at seeing himself so injured by the very people for whom he had done so much good. End of chapter 22. Alright, so he freed a bunch of slaves in the name of, well, mostly himself, and asks them to go and say what he's done so that he can become, so that his fame will grow, and that when he eventually finds a king with a beautiful princess, he'll be joining that army. But alas, they're like, no, which totally makes sense, because obviously they can't all travel in a group, because obviously the Brotherhood is going to be looking for them. Silly, silly. Alright, let's see. 1, 2. Okay, we have time for one more chapter. Maybe. Maybe. Excuse me. There we go. Okay. Chapter 23. Regarding what befell the famous Don Quixote in the Sierra Morena, which was one of the strangest adventures recounted in this true history. Seeing himself so injured, Don Quixote said to his squire, I have always heard, Sancho, that doing good to the low-born is throwing water into the sea. If I had believed what you told me, I should have avoided this grief, but what is done, and so patience, and let it be a lesson for the future. Your Grace will learn the lesson, responded Sancho. "The same way I'm a Turk. But since you say that if you had believed me this trouble could have been avoided, believe me now and avoid one even greater. I'm telling you that you can't use chivalries with the Holy Brotherhood, because they wouldn't give 2 maravedis for all the knights-errant in the world. You should also know that their arrows already seem to be buzzing past my ears." "You are naturally a coward, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "But so that you will not say that I am stubborn and never do as you advise, on this occasion I want to take your advice and withdraw from the ferocity that frightens you so. But it must be on one condition, that never, in life or in death, are you to tell anyone that I withdrew and retreated from this danger out of fear, but only to satisfy your pleas. And if you say otherwise, you will be lying. And from then until and from now until then, and then until now, I shall deny it, and say that you lie, and will lie every time you think or say it, and do not reply, for merely thinking that I am withdrawing and retreating from any danger, especially this one, which seems to carry with it some small shadow of fear, is enough to make me want to remain and wait here alone, not only for the Holy Brotherhood, which you have mentioned and fear so much, but for the brothers of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the 7 Maccabees, and the Castor and Pollux, and all the brothers and brotherhoods that there are in the world." "Señor," responded Sancho, "withdrawing is not running away, and waiting is not sensible when danger outweighs hope. And wise men know to save nothing for tomorrow, and not risk everything in a single day. And you should know that even though I'm rough and low-born, I still know something about what people call proper behavior. And so don't repent by taking my advice, but mount Rocinante if you can, and if not, I'll help you, and follow me, because my brains tell me we need our feet now more than our hands." Don Quixote mounted, not saying another word, and with Sancho leading the way on his donkey, they entered a part of the Sierra Morena that was close by, it being Sancho's intention to cross the entire range and come out at Viso, or Almodovar del Campo, and hide for a few days in that rugged terrain and not be found if the Brotherhood came looking for them. He had been encouraged to do so when he saw that the provisions carried on his donkey had escaped the skirmish with the galley slaves, which he deemed a miracle considering everything else they had taken away. There's a note here, and it says, "Martin de Ricord faithfully follows the first edition of Don Quixote, published in 1605. The second edition, printed a few months later by Juan de la Cuesta, the same printer, introduces a brief passage here, indicating that Gines de Pasamonte, who was also in the mountains, steals Sancho's donkey. The thorny and ambiguous question of why Cervantes does not mention the theft of the donkey in the first edition, usually attributed to an author's oversight or a printer's error, is alluded to in the second part of Don Quixote, published 1615. As soon as Don Quixote entered those mountains, his heart filled with joy, for it was a landscape that seemed suited to the adventures he was seeking. What he recalled were the marvelous events that had befallen knights-errant in similarly desolate and wild places. He rode along, thinking of these things, so enthralled and transported that he thought of nothing else. And Sancho's only care, after deciding that the way was safe, was to satisfy his stomach with what remained of their clerical spoils, and so he rode behind his master, sitting saddle-side on his donkey as he took things out of a sack and packed them away in his belly, and did not care at all about finding any greater fortune as long as he could go along in this fashion. Then he looked up and saw that his master had stopped, and with the tip of his lance was attempting to lift some kind of bundle lying on the ground, and therefore he hurried to offer his help, if necessary. He reached Don Quixote just as he lifted, with the tip of his lance, a saddle cushion with a traveling case attached to it, half rotting, or completely rotting and falling to pieces, but weighing so much that Sancho had to dismount and pick them up, and his master told him to see what was in the traveling case. Sancho did so very quickly, and although the case was closed with a chain and padlock, it was so worn and rotten that he could see what was inside. 4 shirts of fine cambric, and other items of linen as curious as they were clean, and in a handkerchief he found a small pile of gold escudos, and when he saw them he said, "Glory be to heaven for sending us a profitable adventure." And, searching further, he discovered a small diary that was richly decorated. Don Quixote asked for this, but told him to keep the money for himself. Sancho kissed his hands in gratitude and emptied the case of its linens, which he packed away in the sack of provisions. All of this was observed by Don Quixote, who said, "It seems to me, Sancho, that it cannot be otherwise, that some travelers lost his way in these mountains, and was set upon by ruffians, who must have killed him, and carried him to this remote spot to bury him." "That can't be right," responded Sancho, "because if they were thieves, they wouldn't have left the money here." "That is true," said Don Quixote, "and therefore I cannot guess or surmise that this may be. But wait, we shall see if there is something written in this diary that will allow us to investigate and learn what we wish to know." He opened the book, and the first thing he found there, in a kind of rough draft, though written in a very fine hand, was a sonnet, and reading aloud so that Sancho could hear the poem, he said, "Either love was too..." We're going to try that poem again. "Either love has too little understanding, or too much cruelty, or else my grief's not equal to its cause, though it condemns me to suffer this, the harshest kind of torment. But if love is a god, then logic tells us that he is ignorant of nothing, teaches that a god's not cruel. Then who has ordained this terrible anguish that I adore? If I say you, Phyllis, then I am wrong, for evil has no place in so much good. Nor does my woe rain down on me from heaven. Soon I must die, of that I can be sure. When the cause of the sickness is unknown, only a miracle can find the cure." "From this poem," said Sancho, "you can't learn anything, unless that filly there's the one that leads the way out of the tangle." "What filly?" said Don Quixote. "It seems to me," said Sancho, "that your grace mentioned some filly there." "I said Phyllis," responded Don Quixote, "which is undoubtedly the name of the lady about whom the author of this sonnet is complaining, and, by my faith, he seems a reasonable poet, or I know little of the art." "Then," said Sancho, "does your grace also know what poem?" That's not what he asks. "Then," said Sancho, "does your grace also know about poems?" "More than you think," responded Don Quixote, "as you will see when you carry a letter written in verse from top to bottom to my lady Dulcinea of Toboso, because I want you to know, Sancho, that all or most of the knights-errant of a bygone day were great troubadours and great musicians, for these 2 talents, or endowments, I should say, are attributes of enamoured knights-errant, although the truth is that the strophes of the knights of long ago have more spirit in them than skill." "Your grace, read some more," said Sancho, "and soon you'll find something that will satisfy us." Don Quixote turned the page and said, "This is prose, and seems to be a letter." "The kind of letter that's a message, señor, or the legal kind?" asked Sancho. "It seems at first glance to be a love letter," responded Don Quixote. "Read it aloud, your grace," said Sancho. "I really like things that have to do with love." "I should be happy to," said Don Quixote. And, reading it aloud, as Sancho had requested, he saw that it said, "Your false promise and my certain misfortune have taken me to a place from which news of my death will reach your ears before the words of my lament. You rejected me, O ungrateful lady, for one who has more than I, but not one of greater worth. But if virtue were the wealth that is held in high esteem, I would not envy the fortunes of others or weep for my own misfortune. What your beauty erected was demolished by your actions. From the former I understand that you were an angel, and from the latter I know that you are a woman. Go in peace, cause of my conflict, and may heaven grant that the deceptions of your husband remain forever hidden, so that you need not repent of what you did, nor I take my revenge for what I do not desire. Oh man. When he had finished reading the letter, Don Quixote said, "Less from the verses, one can assume that the man who wrote it is a scorned lover." And leafing through almost the entire notebook, he found other verses and letters, some of which he could read and others not. But what they all contained were complaints, laments, suspicions, joys, sorrows, kindnesses, and slights, either celebrated or wept over. While Don Quixote was looking through the book, Sancho looked through the traveling case, and every corner of it and the cushion was searched, scrutinized, and investigated, every seam pulled apart, every tuft of wool untangled, so that nothing would be left behind for want of effort or diligence, for the escudos he had discovered, which amounted to more than 100, had awakened an enormous appetite in him. And though he did not find more than he had already found, he considered as time well spent the tossing in the blanket, the vomiting of the potion, the blessing of the staffs, the fists of the mule driver, the loss of his saddlebags, the theft of his coat, and all the hunger, thirst, and weariness he had endured in the service of his worthy lord, for it seemed to him he had been more than well rewarded when his master favored him and presented his find to him as a gift. The Knight of the Sorrowful Face was left with a great desire to know who the owner of the traveling case might be, supposing, on the basis of the sonnet and letter, the gold coins and excellent shirts, that he must be a well-born and noble lover driven to some desperate end by his lady's scorn and harsh treatment. But since no person appeared in that desolate and rugged place whom he could question, his only concern was to move on, following no other path than the one chosen by Rocinante, which tended to be the one the horse could travel most easily, and always imagining that there was bound to be some extraordinary adventure waiting for him in the thickets. Riding along, thinking these thoughts, at the top of a hill that lay ahead of him, Don Quixote saw a man leaping from crag to crag and bush to bush with uncommon speed. The man appeared to be half-dressed, and he had a heavy black beard, long disheveled hair, no shoes on his feet, and nothing at all on his calves. His thighs were covered by breeches that seemed to be made of tawny velvet, but were so tattered and torn that in many places his skin showed through. His head was bare, and though he moved with the speed we have mentioned, the Knight of the Sorrowful Face saw and noted all these details. He tried to follow him, but could not, because it was beyond the strength of Rocinante to travel that rugged ground, especially since he was by nature slow-paced and phlegmatic. Then Don Quixote imagined that the man was the owner of the saddle cushion and traveling case, and he resolved to look for him until he found him, even if he was obliged to spend a year in those mountains. And so he ordered Sancho to get off his donkey and go around one part of the mountain, and he would go around the other, and in this way they might encounter the man who had so quickly disappeared from view. "I can't do that," responded Sancho, "because when I leave your grace, I'm filled with fear that plagues me with 1,000 different kinds of sudden frights and visions, and I just want to let you know this, so that from now on I won't have to move a finger's width from your presence." "So be it," said the Knight of the Sorrowful Face. "I am very pleased that you wish to take advantage of my courage, which will not fail you, even if your spirit fails your body. Come now, follow after me slowly, or however you can, and let your eyes be like lanterns. We shall circle round this hillock, and perhaps we shall come across the man we saw, who is, beyond any doubt, the owner of what we have found." To which Sancho responded, "It would be much better not to look for him, because if we find him and he's the owner of the money, of course I'll have to return it to him. So it would be better not to undertake a useless task, and let me keep it in good faith until its rightful owner appears in a way that's not so strange or troublesome. And maybe by that time I'll have spent it. And then by the king's law I won't have to pay because I'll be a pauper." There we go. "You are mistaken about that, Sancho," responded Don Quixote. "For now that we have begun to suspect who the owner is, and have had him practically in front of us, we are obliged to search for him and return the money. And if we do not search for him, the strong suspicion we have that he is the owner makes us as culpable as if he really were. Therefore, Sancho, my friend, do not let the search for him grieve you, for my grief will be taken away if I find him." And so he spurred Rocinante, and Sancho followed on his customary donkey. And when they ridden around part of the mountain, they discovered in a stream, lying dead and half eaten by dogs and pecked at by crows, a mule that was saddled and bridled, which was further confirmation of their suspicion that the fleeing man was the owner of both the mule and the saddle cushion. And there is a note that after Sancho followed on his customary donkey, and it says, "By the third edition of Don Quixote, printed by Juan de la Cuesta, the references to Sancho's donkey in the Sierra Morena have been deleted. Here, for example, the revised text says that Sancho was on foot and carrying the donkey's load, thanks to Guinesillo de Pasamonte." It's interesting how little things like that change from edition to edition. As they were looking at the mule, they heard a whistle like that of a shepherd tending his flock, and suddenly, on their left, they saw a good number of goats, and behind the goats, at the top of the mountain, the goatherd, who was a very old man. Don Quixote called to him and asked him to come down. He shouted in response, asking what had brought him to this place that was rarely, if ever, visited except by goats or wolves or the other animals that lived there. Sancho responded that he should come down, and they would give him a good accounting for everything. The goatherd came down, and when he reached Don Quixote, he said, "I'll wager you're looking at the mule that's lying down in that gully. By faith, it's been there for 6 months. Tell me, have you run across the owner?" "We have not run across anyone," responded Don Quixote, "but we found a saddle cushion and traveling case not far from here." "I found them too," responded the goatherd, "but I never wanted to pick them up or go near them because I was afraid there'd be trouble, and they'd say I stole them. The devil's sly, and he puts things under my feet that make us stumble and fall, and we don't know how or why." "That's just what I say," responded Sancho. "I found them too, and I didn't want to get within a stone's throw of them. I found them there, and there they remain." Zero First, thank you so much for the follow. Thank you, thank you. "I found them too, and I didn't want to get within a stone's throw of them. I left them there, and there they remain, just as they were. I don't want a dog with a bell around its neck." And there is a note, and it says, "A traditional expression that means, I don't want things that can cause trouble." "Tell me, my good man," said Don Quixote, "do you know who the owner of these articles might be?" "What I can tell you," said the goatherd, "is that there's a sheep fold about 3 leagues from here, and about 6 months ago, more or less, a young gentleman came there, very courteous in his manner and bearing, riding on that same mule that's lying there dead, and with the same saddle cushion and traveling case you say you found and didn't touch. He asked us which part of this country was the most rugged and remote. We told him it was here where we are now, and that's the truth, because if you go in just half a league more, maybe you won't be able to find your way out. I'm surprised you even got this far, because there's no road or path that leads to this spot. Anyway, as I was saying, when the young man heard our answer, he turned and rode off to the place we told him about, leaving us all pleased by his good looks and surprised at his question and at how fast we saw him riding back towards the Sierra. And then we didn't see him again until a few days later, when he crossed paths with one of our shepherds. And without saying a word, he went up to him and began to punch and kick. And then he went to the donkey with the provisions and took all the bread and cheese it was carrying. And then, with that strange speed of his, he ran back and hid in the Sierra. When some of us goatherds heard about it, we went and looked for him for almost 2 days, and in the wildest part of the Sierra. And then we found him in the hollow of a huge old cork tree. He came out as gentle as you please, and his clothes were torn, and his face was so changed and burned by the sun that we hardly recognized him. But we had seen his clothes before, and even though they were torn, we knew he was the one we were looking for. He greeted us courteously, and in a few polite words he told us not to be surprised at seeing him in that state, because he was performing a certain penance that had been imposed on him because of his many sins. We begged him to tell us who he was, but we could never persuade him to. We always asked that whenever he needed food, for he couldn't get along without it, he should let us know where we could find him. And if he didn't like that idea, at least we ought to come and ask the shepherds for food and not take it from them by force. He thanked us for our offer, asked our forgiveness for his earlier attack, and said that from then on he'd beg food in God's name and not bother anybody at all. As for his dwelling, he said he slept wherever he could find a place when night fell, and when he finished speaking he began to cry so pitifully that even if we'd been made of stone, those of us listening to him would have had to join him, considering how he looked the first time we saw him, and how he looked now. Because, as I told you, he was a very handsome and pleasant young man, and his courteous and agreeable words showed that he was well-born and a gentleman, and though we were country folk, his courtesy was so great that even country folk could recognize it when we heard it. And then, when he was talking at his best, he stopped and fell silent, and looked down at the ground for a good long time, while we were all puzzled and didn't say anything, waiting to see how the fit would end, and feeling very sorry to see him like that, because from the way he opened his eyes wide and stared at the ground for so long, not even moving an eyelash, and then closed them, pressed his lips together, and lowered his eyebrows, we knew that some kind of craziness had come over him. He soon let us know that what we thought was true, because in a great fury he jumped up from the ground where he had been lying and attacked the man closest to him with so much violence and so much anger that if we hadn't pulled him off, he would have beaten and bitten him to death. And as he was doing this, he kept saying, "Ah, false Fernando! Here is where you will pay for the wrong you did me. These hands will rip out your heart, where all the evils live and dwell together, especially fraud and deceit." To these he added other words, and all of them spoke badly of this Fernando and accused him of being a traitor and a liar. We pulled him off with great difficulty, and without saying another word he left us, and ran off into those briars and brambles, so that it was impossible for us to follow him. From this we guessed that his crazy fits came and went, and that somebody named Fernando must have done something bad to him, so bad that it brought him to this state, all of which turned out to be true, since there have been many times when he comes out onto the path, sometimes to ask the shepherds to give him something to eat, and other times to take it from them by force, because when the craziness is on him, even though the shepherds offered food to him willingly, he doesn't accept it, but punches them and steals it from them, and when he is in a good mind he asks for the food in God's name, courteously and reasonably, and offers up many thanks for it, and some few tears. And the truth is, señores, the goat-herder continued, that yesterday 4 other herders and I, 2 helpers and 2 friends of mine, decided that we would look for him until we found him, and after we found him, whether he went willingly or we had to force him, we'd take him to the town of Almodovar, which is 8 leagues from here, and there we'd have him cured, if his sickness has a cure, or find out who he is when he's in his right mind, and if he has his kinfolk, we could tell about his misfortune. And this, señores, is all I can tell you about what you've asked me. And you should know that. The owner of the articles you found in the same half-dressed man you saw running so fast. For Don Quixote had already told him how he had seen the man leaping among the crags of the Sierra. Don Quixote was astonished at what he had heard from the goatherd, and more desirous than ever to know who the unfortunate madman was, and he resolved to do what he had already thought about doing, to look for him all over the mountain, searching every corner and cave until he found him. But fate did what he was planning and hoping to do, and did it better, because at that very instant, in a ravine that led to the place where they were standing, the young man he was seeking appeared, walking and talking to himself and saying things that could not be understood up close, let alone from a distance. His dress was as it had been described, except that as he approached, Don Quixote saw that a torn leather jerkin he was wearing had been tanned with ambergris, which led him to conclude that a person who wore such clothing could not be of a low category. When the young man reached them, he greeted them in a hoarse and rasping voice, but with great courtesy. Don Quixote returned the greeting with no less courtesy, and, after dismounting Rocinante with a gallant air and presence, he went forward to embrace him, and held him close for a long while, as if he had known him for some time. The other man, whom we can call the ragged one of the gloomy face, as Don Quixote is he of the sorrowful one, allowed himself to be embraced, and then stepped back, placed his hands on Don Quixote's shoulders, and stood looking at him, as if wanting to see if he knew him, no less astonished, perhaps, at the face, form, and arms of Don Quixote than Don Quixote was at the sight of him. Finally, the first to speak after their embrace was the ragged one, and he said what will now be recounted. End of chapter 23. And that is going to be where we end today. Look how far we are. We're getting there. We're on page 182. Things are happening. Okay, so they freed the slaves, and then now they're in the mountains with, of course, no provisions. Again, that seems to happen very frequently with them. And they're going through and they find a saddlebag with a lot of linens and monies and a notebook full of writings and poetry and everything like that. And they've come to the conclusion that it is written by a man who has been scorned. And so they're riding along and they come across a goat herd, and he's telling this story of this person. Well, they're walking along and they see a man who's like super like burly and unkempt and all that and running around the mountain. So they try to find him. Almost done with the prologue. Exactly. And then they run into the goat herd, and the goat herd just explained the story. Yeah, page 182 just started. Exactly. I don't remember how many pages did we say that there were? Let's see. Is this the end? Is this the end? Sniffy Pigeon! Thank you so much for the follow. Okay, so this one has 940. This edition, anyway. But the font is super tiny, so I would not doubt that other editions have larger pages. Yeah, or more pages. Like, look, the font is so small. It's really small. And then the footnotes are like half the size of that. My little eyeballs. Yeah, and other editions have illustrations too. Right. Which I'm gonna have to look them up to see. 'Cause I didn't know that they had illustrations, and now I'm curious to see what they all look like. I want to know. Not on every. It's a picture book. But one or two per chapter. Okay, interesting. So when we were reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, there were pictures on that too. It's just, it is interesting how many like older books had pictures And that doesn't seem to really be a thing anymore for like modern books, unless it's like a nonfiction book and you're like showing a diagram or something. Although I did just read one, Hidden Pictures, that had drawings and stuff on it because like that was super central to the story. It was like a little kid drawing creepy pictures of like people that nobody else could see. But oops. But yeah, that is interesting. Like the illustration is lost. Well, and I think what is it? There is a is it it's the same author that has the like Explaining Diabetes with Owls book, but it's something about like a squirrel and a chipmunk, and it's short stories, and that also has pictures in it. So it's just interesting, just things, just cool things. But yeah, I am still enjoying this. I do like the humor that is thrown in. The humor is so wide ranging, it seems like we had like a whole section about poop. I'm still here. Yes. Oh, hey. You might not be able to. If you whisper it to me, I can post it. Um, but yeah, like the humor is just so interesting. Like there's like a whole like page just talking about pooping, but it wasn't written like crassly, but you knew what was happening. It's just so interesting. It's silly and I enjoy it. Okay, there we go. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Wadsworth. Okay, cool. I am copying the link. Maybe. I'm just gonna click it. It won't let me just do an easy copy. Cool. Cool, cool. Okay. Here's the link that Wadsworth was trying to paste. Or trying to post. Yeah. Ooh, and the illustrations are like super detailed too. Amazing. That's wild. That's that's a wild picture. That's the style, yeah. And you remember that one from the Spanish versions you read in college. Cool, cool. Oof. Yeah, the illustration is super detailed. There's like so much fine line work in there. It's amazing. It's amazing. You don't see that now. You don't get that. Hmm. So yes, that's gonna be it for today. We done good. We are a slither into the book. But yes, I will be back very soon, reading more. We'll continue right where we left off. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I appreciate the support and I appreciate you. Thank you so much. And I will see you very soon. Have a good rest of your night, day, evening, whatever time it is. And I'll see you later.